Basically, I just talk about really cool biology papers and research that's been happening that isn't really covered in the news.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on. We're going to talk a little bit about natural selection. And for those that don't know, I have criticisms of natural selection. I accept evolutionary biology in terms of the narratives they put forth in terms of why we have a lot of the phenotypes that we have, or the speciations, or um, I think that the narratives like common ancestry and all of that, the age, fossil record, that's all good. I just think that biologists give way too much credit to this touted mechanism called natural selection. And I think there's some conceptual confusions with it. And so I'm not a creationist, I'm an atheist, right? I think the practical implications of my argument really has to do with it has little to do with how biologists should, what sort of things they should change in terms of what they do in the lab or in the field. I don't really have any criticisms of that. It's more of what's going on when they're talking about natural selection. What are they doing? What are they thinking about? How are they thinking about natural selection? And who are they giving credit, or what are they giving credit to when they think they've explained why you have a particular change in allelic frequency? Yeah. So I think we have a mutual friend, Titan. I think hopefully he's here. Maybe he's not, but you can. Yeah, we have a mutual friend. That's how he introduced us. And yeah, so the first thing is that I think he sent you a statement where I just very briefly described the argument, and you sensed a confusion there. And so I thought we could talk about that first.
Yeah, I watched the part of the stream where you were talking about it. Was a big part of the your stream, so I didn't watch all of it, but it was like at
Mhm.
least the first however many minutes.
With Lena.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So maybe you're not responding to this, but essentially, I take the problem to be this. So natural selection, right? When you're talking about explanation, explanations can occur in an extensional or intentional context, and it's unfortunate when I use the word intentional. It's with an S, so we're not talking about like intentionality, like in the philosophy of mind. Although there is a loose relation there because intentionality has propositional content, and we'll talk about that in a second. But intentional explanation, if natural selection is an intentional explanation, that means that if you have these descriptions, let's say about a variable, whether it be ecological, phenotypic, in this case, phenotypic, um, any co-referring description that you have for that trait, if you substitute it, well, it doesn't necessarily preserve truth value. And in the case of natural selection, it's likely to be false, in fact, because there are co-referring descriptions of traits that don't entail anything to do with fitness. And so, um, given that it's an intentional form of explanation, extensional forms of explanation are sort of blind to co-referring descriptions in the sense that when you substitute a co-referring description, so like if you know, I gave the example of a cue ball hitting the eight ball. The cue ball is
Hmm.
it's gonna be true no matter what. If you substitute eight ball for black ball or the ball that you need a pocket to win the game,
Hmm.
there's all these descriptions you could substitute there. It'll always be true because the cue ball is not sensitive to the descriptions.
Okay.
Um, Natural selection is sensitive to descriptions. The example that Fodor gives is the heart that pumps blood and the heart that makes noises. The examples I might be using here is when we're talking about the finches in the Galapagos. There are islands with finches with larger beaks, and those larger beaks are going to be shiny beaks. And so the large beaks are coextensional with the shiny beaks and that environment. And so the idea is that natural selection sort of operates on the large beaks, not on the shiny beaks. And so the statement would be something like natural selection explains why the large beaks move to fixation. When you substitute that co-referring term, natural selection explains why the shiny beaks move to fixation. That's going to be false. So that's why it's considered to be an intentional explanation with an S, not a T. S. So it's not extensional. And if it's an intentional explanation, then you need propositional content to be able to disambiguate between the co-referring terms. But natural selection has no such propositional content concerning placeholders like beaks or birds or islands or seeds of the sort to be able to disambiguate between those covariant terms. So it fails as an explanation. And that's kind of the argument
Mm-hmm.
and in its most original form, I guess. But there are a lot of ways to articulate the argument. This is just the way that I have been articulating it. And so that's the argument in a nutshell.
Okay. Um, So I guess I think that from watching the stream video and your explanation right now, I think that you're basically conflating evolution and natural selection, and there's basically two different processes that are happening, and I think that that's why what's happening. So, like, evolution happens between a population of organisms that are interbreeding with one another. So basically, what happens is that there are errors that are made with DNA polymerase and the replication of DNA, and there's a diversity of the genomic sequence in a population. So even in something that's really simple, like the genes that are going to code for example, eyes, something really basic and fundamental, they're actually going to have a lot of different nucleotide sequences that are going to be able to make that gene to make the eyes. There's probably a lot of genes, but let's just say there's one, and they do that because of the genetic code. So there's basically three nucleotides that code for a codon, and that leads to amino acid, and then that leads to a peptide sequence, and then that leads to a protein, right? So the genetic code, which is that square thing that has a bunch of the different three letters, the nucleotides, the genetic code, basically that allows for multiple nucleotide sequences to make the same protein. So basically, in a population that's going to be breeding within each other amongst themselves, the diversity is going to increase over time, and that diversity of their genomes is going to allow them to kind of withstand and allow them to go through different events. So in this case, the events that we're talking about are natural selection. So these are speciation events. So they're called abiotic or biotic. So biotic would be anything biological. So this would be predation, this would be viruses, that kind of thing. Abiotic pressures are going to be like environmental, temperature, pH, that kind of stuff. And basically those mutations, it can be any gene. Those mutations that are going to accrue basically allow them to withstand that, and it's pretty simple. So like, I don't feel like evolution's really taught that well, but this is an example that I give. So like, let's say we're a population of flies. Okay, so we're a fly population, and we're normally living in a really hot habitat. So there's a lot of heat shock proteins that are made when it's really hot outside, that allows us to make sure that our proteins aren't denatured when we're exposed to the heat. We have to leave for some reason. There's a speciation event. We have to leave, and we are cut off from our old habitat, and we're going to a new one. All right, so we're a population of flies, and we're going to like a tree. Let's say we land on a tree, and there's a toxin there. Now, there's going to be a portion of that population that has the mutations necessary in order to actually change that heat shock protein to basically the conformation that would be needed in order to deal with the toxin. So maybe it's like an mRNA sequence that needs to be made in order to take down and bind to that mRNA sequence, that toxin, that kind of stuff. So that's why the mutations in the population are going to be that mechanism that you're thinking about, that basically can allow organisms to apply that genetic diversity in a lot of different scenarios. So this could be antibiotic resistance, toxin resistance. This could be pseudogenes, which is genes that are turned off because they're not needed anymore.
I don't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead.
But
Yeah.
I'm fine with all of this, right? This is just not my issue with natural selection or evolutionary biology. I'm wondering where in my argument, let's say that's on the screen that you're saying is wrong. Other than the conclusion is that natural selection can't explain. I guess let's start with: do you think natural selection explains anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, it explains for all the species that exist in the world today.
Okay. Do you think that's it's a form of intentional explanation or extensional explanation?
I don't know, like how, like I'm not familiar enough with these words and these concepts in order to like make that argument. I would say.
Okay.
Um,
So what are you responding to exactly? And like in above, like in my premises or exactly? Because
Well, in your example, I think that you're saying that the shiny beak and the different types of beak, you can't swap them out. And I think that which is
you think
right.
you can?
Well, the common denominator between those two would be the DNA, right? And mutations in the DNA could, for some reason, maybe, I don't know, maybe there is like a bird population that maybe
But do you
that's
think you can
shiny.
swap them out though? I'm just wondering.
What do you mean? I'm
So
sorry.
like that example was in the context of this statement. Natural selection explains why the large beaks move to fixation. That's going to be true and for some island in the Galapagos, right? Natural selection explains why the large beak moves to fixation because of the seeds or whatever. Now, when you substitute the term natural selection explains why the shiny beaks move to fixation, that's false, right? Natural selection doesn't explain why the shiny boots move to fixation. Something else explains that.
No,
Because
it could be some type of like toxin. It could be a waxy substance that is on the beak for whatever reason that creates some type of fitness advantage.
right, so it's
Whatever
false,
gives.
right? Isn't it false that natural selection explains why the shiny beaks move to fixation?
No, any trait can be evolved for through natural selection.
Okay, but in the case of the Galapagos, so the specific case we're talking about is what Darwin observed in one of the islands. One of the islands, there were finches with larger beaks, and he noticed that in on those islands you had larger seeds, okay, or you had a type of vegetation. And so the idea is that he came to the belief that the larger beaks were conducive to fitness. He did not think of the shiny beaks as being conducive to fitness. And so
Hmm.
what's going on there is that there's a statement that he would want to assent to. That the statement is that natural selection explains why the large beaks move to fixation in that population. That seems true on the adaptationist program, right? It does not explain, however, why the shiny beaks move to fixation. That's not going to be explained. That statement's going to be false. And so what you've done there is when you substituted a co-referring term, that just and the fact that one is false and one is true implies that natural selection is an intentional kind of explanation. It occurs in an intentional context. Whereas in extensional context, when you substitute the co-referring terms, it'll be true no matter what. So I guess, do we agree that natural selection is a form of intentional explanation?
Um, I mean, all of these, again, I don't understand these terms like well enough in order to actually
Mm-hmm.
make it like a definitive statement because I don't know what you're referring to, and I'm not read well enough on these terms in order to say that. Like,
That's fine.
but
I'll
I
try
think
to go ahead.
but the the idea is there is a natural process that explains why these things happen and why they accrue, and by it moves to fixation, I think that you're referring to like why they actually appear in mass in a population. Is that right?
Well, the idea is that there's a certain allelic frequency, let's say at 32% of within a population, and when you have a change in allelic frequency, you can imagine a graph, and there's going to be a point where it plateaus, and that's moving to fixation. So if you have a population of finches, 32% of them have large beaks, and over generational time, that percentage increases to 95%, and then it remains at 95%. That's the trait moving to fixation. And so there's a question about what explains that allelic frequency change, that change in allelic frequency? And what the Darwinist program, the adaptationist program, I want to say, is that natural selection explains why the large beaks move to that 95%, that move to fixation, right? But it doesn't explain why the shiny beaks move to the fixation, that will be explained via something else because it's a hitchhiker. Okay, it's expandrel or ride-along trait. There are a lot of terms for. In fact, arguably, it might even be deleterious. Okay, shiny. We could even think that's true. And if it's deleterious, then definitely natural selection doesn't explain why that trait moved to fixation.
No, that's
So
absolutely not true. There's a lot of different reasons why something would be evolved to not happen to a deleterious
what
trait.
are you saying is not true?
That I mean, so like there's examples of like geckos, for example, that have gone into caves and that don't need their eyesight anymore because it's a cave and it's dark. So they accumulate mutations in the gene that make their eyes and accrue
But what did you
stop
say that wasn't
codons.
true? I'm not having trouble responding. Like, what did I said that if they're deleterious traits, traits that are not conducive to fitness,
But that's but
then
the deleterious mutations are just ones that stop basically like maybe the protein from being made. There can be, is that what you're saying?
sure,
Or
yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of different reasons why that would happen in a
Yeah, I'm not, but
population.
I'm just saying it doesn't make very much sense to say natural selection operates on deleterious traits unless you're taking a case where natural selection is just about selection against, in which case then you still have an inverse problem. Natural selection would operate on deleterious traits, so not traits that are being selected for. But I'm
They're
confused.
all being selected for, like, so for example, that gecko example, like they had eyes, they were geckos and they had eyes, but then they went into caves and they accumulated deleterious mutations in their genome that stopped the production of the eyes. And you'd think that like, oh, why would they want to get rid of their eyes? Eyesight's so important. When
Wait,
it's,
but
well,
not
it's
all
like,
traits are selected for. Like, there's a very famous paper by Stephen Gould, I think Jay Gould and Lewintow, I forgot his first name. What they talk about is this notion of a spandrel, or there are other names for it, hitchhiker traits, traits that are not conducive to fitness, that are riding along with the trait of interest or the trait that's being selected for. And so,
yeah, but they have to, even
very,
hitchhiker traits still have to give some fitness advantage. This
I,
happens. Absolutely. Yeah. This is why this.
no,
So yeah, you
by
see,
definition, no.
no. You see this a lot in like genome size. So for example, like you have like really highly related like species, but sometimes like the closely related species will have like double the size genome. It's like, well, why does that happen? It's like, well, because there's environmental or biological predation that happens that requires them to have, it's called phenotypic elasticity, where it allows them to actually go and change their morphology or things about themselves in order to adapt to those pressures. So genome size, a higher genome size just means that you've selected for, the natural selection has selected for genome size that is larger than something that is, smaller, because actually a smaller genome size means it's easier to replicate. You don't have problems with DNA polymerase errors. It's actually a lot better, in an efficiency argument to have a smaller genome. But in order to live, populations have evolved to have these extra genomes that people have said in the past, like, oh, this is just junk DNA or whatever, but that's all wrong.
Yeah, well, look, I think I think the literature is pretty clear on this. That, like, if I'm assuming you then disagree with people like Gould and Lewintow, there are traits that do not contribute to fitness. That's true, right? I mean, that seems very clear in the literature, in the biological literature. In fact, there are traits that are not only not being selected for, they're basically, as I see it, there are three categories, right? There are traits that are being selected for, there are traits that are riding along, and there are traits that are deleterious. Okay.
No. Their genomes are all selected for at the same time.
Well, I don't know what you mean by selected for any. I mean, like, I'm not talking about necessarily genomes, although genomes are going to be part of that explanation. I'm talking about those phenotypes. Phenotypes are going to matter, right? Like the color of a rabbit in the Arctic matters to fitness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But
Okay.
that rabbit could also have a large genome that allows that coat to change colors based off of the temperature of the surrounding area. So they could have it's called phenotypic elasticity. I wouldn't go by phenotypes. That would be the last thing. That is not a good way in order to look at evolution and natural selection, is through phenotypes. It's all about the genotypes.
Yeah, but the point is that I'm fine with saying that every phenotype is explained by some genotype. But the point is that if you, I'm fine with saying that genotypes, certain genes are going to be selected for and certain ones are not. But that's going to correspond to, they're going to
No,
be.
so those genes that if they're not selected for, you just lose them in the genome. Like there's no reason to keep them, and there's going to be mutations that accrue to just turn those genes off. Or in a population, there's going to be not people, but organisms that lose that part of their genome because there's double-stranded breaks that happen all the time in the genome. So if you don't need that portion of your DNA, it's just going to go away. This is a good example is actually humans. So we actually, as mammals, we require vitamin C, but we actually can't make our own vitamin C. And it's like, why is that? It's because we had so much citrus in our diet that we accrued mutations in the vitamin C gene, and it actually turned it off, which is called a pseudogene. So it's in our genomes, but it's just turned off.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to side with biologists when it comes to this distinction between what's being selected for, what traits that are that are conducive to fitness, and traits that are not conducive to fitness. Right. I think there's plenty of citations here. I would cite the paper Lewontin and Gould. There's plenty of work on hitchhiker traits, and the whole concept of hitchhiker traits are traits that are riding along with traits that are being selected for. And if you're denying that distinction, I don't really know what to say. I mean, we can get into the citations. I mean, there are examples in biology of hitchhikers. I mean, I could literally make up hitchhikers, right? The exact size of my chin might not be what's being selected for, right? I mean, that there are going to be. I don't see why you're rejecting this distinction. This is a distinction that's seen in the
I don't know
biological
what you mean
literature.
by the Lehman-Told and Gould paper. Where
It's
do
a
you have
very
it?
famous paper. It's called The Spaniels of San Marco. Let me see.
Spaniels of San Marco.
Yeah. Um, this paper, I'm gonna put it on the screen.
Okay.
So it's
Oh, it's a paper from 1979. Okay.
yeah. But it's not like any, there have been no, it's been like staple. It's like a very famous paper. There's not refutations of this distinction. But Gould and Lewontin wrote a paper here. Basically the idea is that they gave an example of, think of an architect, um, where the architect wants arches in a building, and there are these byproducts. When you build arches, you get this like kind of corner. Like here's like a spandrel, right? This like area right here. Okay, you want the arch, but in once the architect is going for the arch, but in creating the arch, you get a byproduct of a corner called a spandrel. And this is not what the designer cares about. He cares about the arch, but it's just a byproduct of creating an arch. And so this was um, kind of applied to biology, that you have certain traits, like for instance, my heart pumps blood. Okay, that is being selected for. It's conducive to fitness. It's their natural selection operates on something like that. It explains why there's but then it makes certain noises, right? It makes thump thump noises, and that ride alongs with the heart that makes pumping, that pumps. And the specific noises, um, at least in the history, are in this kind of locality, um, it doesn't really matter, right? There's some kind of counterfactual. Had the noises not been there, or had the noises been a little bit different, that there would have been no changes in that trait moving fixation, and that's how we understand a spandrel or a hitchhiker. Hitchhikers are there's gonna be some kind of counterfactual. Had the hitchhiker not been there, the trait would have still moved to fixation. And you can do deconfounding experiments to kind of verify this, right? So, um, but yeah, I I mean, don't you think that there are traits in populations that if they did not have that, all the corresponding traits or the traits that are correlated with that hitchhiker that are being selected for, those would still move to fixation, and that's how you identify a hitchhiker, and that's how you know that it's not conducive to fitness.
Sorry, I'm trying to read the original paper here, trying to
Yeah.
understand. The Do you want to read the abstract together of the actual paper,
Yeah.
Mark?
Do you have the link?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I have the Sci-Hub link.
you can just put it in the private chat if you want, or I can find it. Looks like you already have it. Okay, let me put this up. I mean, I don't know, but what did you think about what I said? Like, let me put this up 1 second.
Any part of
The
the
idea.
genome that isn't basically like that part of the genome, the hitchhiking part, isn't
Mhm.
hitchhiking in the fact that it's not doing anything. Like it is doing something and it is
But
being
there's a
selected for.
counterfactual, right? There's a counterfactual. Had the hitchhiker not been there, that trait still would have moved to fixation. That allele would have still moved to fixation.
No, because you're thinking about it at the individual level. This things happen at the population level
I'm talking
in
about population.
evolution.
So, like, take a population of humans, right? There's a set of genetics, a whole set of genes that explain why you have a heart that pumps blood. Those genes will also explain why your heart makes certain types of noises, okay, rather than other types of noises. And so there's a counterfactual. Say in a hypothetical, those you were able to detach the noises, would those genes or that phenotype still move to fixation? The answer is still yes, right? Because those genes are conducive to fitness. And that's where natural selection comes in, right? But it's true that, and if that's true, then that means that if those traits still move to fixation in the same way that they did with the same kind of allelic frequencies, then those the hitchhiker traits, in this case the thump thump noises or this particular noises, are not explanatory in terms of why the trait moved to fixation. And so they're not conducive to fitness.
Then I mean, then they could just be removed, right? Is that what you're saying?
In principle, they could be removed. I
Okay.
mean, we might not be able to do it,
Okay, so
right?
if
But
two populations, if there was one population that had them removed and one
mhm.
population that didn't, the population that would have it removed would be doing better.
No, there
Yeah.
wouldn't be a difference,
Yeah, no,
right?
there would be just there is effort and nutrients that is put into replicating DNA. If you're making a protein that you don't need, those are nutrients that you're using as an organism that you don't need. That is actually a harm for you as an organism. And any organism that is
Wait,
in the same
I'm confused.
population,
I'm confused.
they're going to outcompete you.
I'm confused. I'm talking about two populations of humans, okay?
Okay.
One of which have the pumping mechanism, just like they both have the same pumping mechanism, and they're in a similar kind of environment that we're in now, okay? But one population, instead of thump thump, it makes thumpity thump noises, okay? Um, now, is there going to be a change? Would there be, historically speaking, would you expect a change in allelic frequency? And I would say no. Um,
Well, there's a
the
physiological reason why you have that
Sure, I'm
sound.
not. I'm not suggesting that there
So if
isn't.
the physiological thing is what's going to be the act, the through evolution you're going to make mutations that have that physiological difference, and basically through evolution and natural selection you're going to have organisms that are the higher fitness be able to go forward.
Wait, did you understand the hypothetical? The
Yeah,
point is that everything is physiologically the same.
it's not though.
Okay.
If it's
No,
not.
but
If they're
I'm
making different
stipulating that in the
noises, then they have a
hypothetical.
physiological difference.
I'm stipulating that in the
Well,
hypothetical,
then
though.
that doesn't exist in the real world. So then what are we
That's why
doing?
it's a hypothetical.
No, but but we have real
Hypotheticals don't
examples.
exist. If I met God, right, I would probably ask him, "Why did you create me?" But that's not real, right? That's a hypothetical. Okay. So in the same way, if you take a hypothetical case where you have two populations of humans, One makes the normal kind of thump thump noise that we're familiar with. The other one either deviates from that thump thump noise or doesn't have a noise. We wouldn't expect the alleles that correspond to explaining the pumping mechanism those allelic frequencies wouldn't change. They would still just as well move to fixation because the noises that your heart makes, right, doesn't play a fitness role.
But they're physiological reasons why they're making that noise. So
I'm not disputing that.
there's natural causes for the reason why
I'm
these
not
things
disputing that
happen.
either.
But that's what's being selected
Do we
for.
agree on do we agree that there wouldn't be a change in allelic there wouldn't be a difference in allelic frequencies across generational time in those two populations?
We don't know. I mean, that's hard to say. I mean, that's hard to say.
Do you think that
You would accrue deleterious mutations in the population that had extra DNA that wasn't selected for. You just
no, there is
would.
no extra DNA?
Of course there would be. Of course there
No,
would
it's a
be.
hypothetical, right? It's a hypothetical. What I'm doing is I'm disambiguating or I'm deconfounding the phenotypic traits, right? But I'm leaving the alleles, the actual genetics, right? And for sure, it could be physically impossible, but it doesn't matter. What it does illustrate is that the specific noises that your heart makes, as compared to another set of noises, wouldn't change the fitness, the overall fitness of the population, and you would expect that those traits, the pumping mechanism, would move to fixation just as well.
I mean, okay. I think I that the noises that your heart makes is intricately combined with the chambers of our heart, and
I'm
though
not
changing
disputing
those.
that, but you understand I'm not disputing that.
In your hypothetical worlds, I don't know how natural selection or anything would work because I'm not a biologist or a scientist in that world, so I don't even know.
Wait, but
I don't
scientists
know.
use deconfounding experiments all the time, right? They think in terms of counterfactuals, right? Like, okay, here I have a hypothesis. This is what I should expect, and that they're again engaging in a hypothetical, right? So, when you invoke an explanation, you think about, oh, had there not been that cause or that explanation, a different set of events would have obtained. Those are just hypothetical. So I'm just saying, right? In a world where the pumping mechanism is in place, and you have in both populations, but there's the only difference between the two populations is that you have a variation of noises, different noises between the two populations in terms of what the noises your heart makes. Would you expect any difference in allelic frequencies? And I'm just saying no, right? We wouldn't because we don't think of the specific noises that our heart makes as being a contributor to fitness, right? I thought that was taken for. I thought that would be obvious.
I mean, everything is something that can be evolved for. Everything. So there could be different ways that you have your. That just I've never heard of that before.
Maybe I should frame it this way. Tom made a good point. Think of the control group, right? So we're wondering. Here's our question. We're wondering: do the noises that our heart makes would that have an impact on in some kind of way on the allelic frequencies of the heart that pumps blood, right? And or the trait frequencies of the heart. Okay, and so we have a control group. We have a heart. We can envision or imagine a population with the heart that pumps blood, but it doesn't make thump thump noises. And we have a population that doesn't have those noises, right? But it still pumps blood. And then the question is, we compare it with the control group and see, does pump the noises that the heart makes make any kind of difference in the allelic frequencies? And
But
it seems like it's obviously no, it
but
wouldn't.
we okay. So but we don't work in a world where like sounds or anything are kind of like the central dogma for how this all works. It's DNA. It's DNA is the central underlying, code for how these things happen. So in a world that would actually happen, we would be taking apart You take this, you take your hypothesis. Okay, so how the experiment would actually work is we would take your hypothesis, we would go to an animal model that has a similar chambered heart, and then we would go in through genetic modification, knock out the parts of the genes that we feel like are giving us that difference in sound, and then we would be able to analyze the mutant group versus the wild type group, which is the wild type is the non-mutagenized, and they would be able to see cardiovascular health. Does this mutant actually confer any type of cardiovascular advantage? And then we would be able to test that. So we would test that through a bunch of different ways, oxygenation. I don't know, a lot of different ways for to see how healthy the organism is, and then we could see whether or not that is an essential gene. Essential gene is what we kind of
I
call
don't
these
think what I'm
things.
saying is that complicated. I'm just going to ask you, right?
But
Do you think that
what about
humans,
what I just said? Why?
it's irrelevant, right? Let me explain why it's irrelevant. All I'm asking you is this. Hey, Greg, if humans had different sounds coming from their hearts, instead of thump doink, it made thumpity thump. Do you think that that would change our the fitness of the heart? That's my question to you. What would you think?
I don't think about it in that way. I think about it in the
You don't
DNA
know.
and think about like I would devise an experiment and actually test it through hypotheses and observations. So
So you
I
don't
don't
know.
know
You don't
what would
know.
happen. There could be a lot of different ways. There could be reasons
Sure.
for
But what do you think?
that would be
What
an
do you
essential gene or
You're
not.
just saying I don't know. You're just saying I don't know, right? Well, fine. I'll take a different trick. Okay. Let's take something that we could probably that would help maybe. Because I think what you're trying to say is that it's physically impossible to test it. That could be
No, I'm
true.
not
It's
saying that.
physically.
I'm not saying it's physically impossible. I gave you an experiment that would allow us to to test this. So I'm no, I'm actually
You
working
said
with you.
I thought earlier you said it's physically impossible for the genes to remain the same but not have noises.
I just gave you an animal model experiment with with a control group that we could actually use, and methods
Okay,
to see it and an expected result. I gave you
I'm
I
not
gave you
really
everything. I'm
understand.
working
It's
with you.
fine. Let me just go to a different trait because I think the heart example, people don't like the heart example. Think the
Okay.
Galapagos finches again. So you're wondering, you go to the Galapagos, you see the big shiny beaks, okay? And you want to know if the allelic frequencies would be any different if the beaks had not been shiny. So what you do is you go to the finches, you take them all and you shade their beak. You shade it dark. Okay. And then you then look at the populations across several generations and you see that there is no change in allelic frequency. There is no change, which means that the shiny beak, right, played no fitness role. Because if it did play a fitness role, what you would expect is that the allelic frequencies would decrease. Okay. So that's all I'm trying to describe. That's what a hitchhiker is. A hitchhiker is going to be a trait where if you removed it from the population, there wouldn't be a change in allelic frequency. You wouldn't, all else being equal.
Yeah, and if it doesn't have any fitness advantage amongst any type of environment, abiotic or biotic, and it's just extra like DNA that's been there that isn't needed, you're gonna lose it through molecular mechanisms like double-stranded breaks.
Wait, do we agree on that? I couldn't tell if you were agreeing.
I don't understand your premise, so it's hard to agree to anything that you're saying, to be honest with you.
Look, did you understand that we
Yeah,
were
I
wondering?
understand, like I understand what you're trying to say, but I'm telling you that like um it's more, you can't just make those jump to those conclusions. Like you would have to
I didn't
do.
jump to a conclusion. Look, listen to what I said, right? We don't know if it's the shiny beak, if the shiny beak is conducive to fitness. So what we do is we think of this experiment where we take all every finch and we shade the beak to black so it's not shiny anymore. Then we take a lot of data about across several generations, and here's what we would expect if it did not contribute to fitness. We wouldn't expect a change in the allelic frequencies that correspond to beaks, right? We wouldn't expect any change in allelic frequency. Okay. And if
But
it
it
didn't, and
could.
if
But it could, man. You don't know. The shiny beak might actually be like conducive to something that you don't understand,
That's
that hasn't
fine. But I'm
happened.
just saying, in the hypothetical where there is no change in allelic frequency after we run our experiment, that would show that the shiny beaks are not conducive to fitness, all else being equal. Because if it were conducive to fitness and we removed that trait, we'd expect that allelic frequency to decrease. In fact, what I should say is that we can separate the populations of finches. We could have one shiny beak, half of them shiny beaks, half of them shaded in beaks. And if there is no change in allelic frequencies, then the shiny beak is not a contributor to fitness.
You don't know that because that could have just not been the test parameters might not have tested where that is actually tested, where that speciation event is actually put to the test. So you can't make that conclusion.
What are you saying? I don't know. What are you saying? It's all hypothetical.
I know, and I'm saying hypothetically, there could be another condition why that shiny
That's why I
beak
said
would
all else
actually
being
lead to
equal.
a fitness advantage, but you haven't tested for it yet.
You need to be careful because I said all else being equal. All else being equal means let's rule out things like genetic drift, gene flow, mutation. All else being equal, if we're wondering whether shiny beaks are conducive to fitness, we take a control group of there are finches with shiny beaks, and then we have our shaded in beaks. Okay, we have two populations. We then measure them across generational time, and if the allelic frequencies are not changed, then we know that the shiny beak plays no role in fitness, all else being equal, when we're just examining this thing called natural selection.
I mean, in this crazy hypothetical with no genetic drift, no mutations, no immigration or emigration, no one. I mean, like, okay, yeah, I can understand.
Okay, so that is just what a hitchhiker trait is. It's a trait that exists in a population that is not conducive to fitness, and the way you know that is that you can perform experiments, you can rely on previous data that if you remove that trait from the population, we wouldn't expect any change in allelic frequencies.
In your hypothetical, that doesn't exist in the real
So
world.
that's the concept of a hitchhiker
No, but
trait.
we had all these things where we're not allowing genetic drifts or mutations or emigration or immigration or all these things, and that's just a hypothetical that you created, man. That is not what happens in the real world. In your hypothetical, maybe, but that's not what happens in the real world.
I'm telling you what a hitchhiker trait is. Because you were saying that earlier, you said that every trait is being selected for, but
Yeah.
that's clearly false.
And
Because you can run
yes, the genome
experiments.
size is one of those things that is selected for. Absolutely, yes.
Okay, but
In the real world.
in that hypothetical where we run that experiment, right? That where the allelic frequencies don't change, and we're bracketing other mechanisms. Okay, um, then that is an example of a trait. That would be an example of a trait that's not conducive to fitness, right? That would
In this
be
crazy
how we.
hypothetical that doesn't exist in the real world and
You could
that
perform
ever
that
happens.
experiment. Look, Greg, you can perform that experiment. That's not even that crazy.
What
You can
are you
literally
kidding me?
take.
Of course we can. Well, you can't have
What's crazy about it?
you're gonna have you're gonna have a population genetics experiment that doesn't have any type of genetic drift, DNA polymerase error, any type of emigration or immigration, anything like that. Like, what do you mean? What are you talking
You
about?
can
Of course
control
you
for
can't.
those. Do you think you can control for those?
No, because you have DNA polymerase errors that aren't perfect. That none of them are perfect. You're going to have errors that accrue in populations. Natural selection happens that way. So you can't ever have this thing. You can't ever have this experiment. It never exists.
So you're telling me that I can't know if shiny beaks are conducive to fitness. That's what you're implying.
Because there might be an environmental condition that you're not testing for where that gives a fitness advantage.
Yeah, look, but that's not gonna just because there could be a mechanism doesn't mean undermine our knowledge that it's not conducive to fitness.
I'm sorry, one more time. I didn't understand the
Just
point you're
because
making.
there could be a mechanism that is interfering with our experiment doesn't mean that we don't know or we can't know whether a trait is conducive to fitness or
That's not,
not.
we're not creating things that are interfering with our experiments. That is the experiment, man. That is what we are scientists for, in order to find these things. And that's the whole point of it. That is that biology doesn't exist in this aseptic world without any externalities or anything going on. This is what is actually happening, and this is the real world versus these
I'm confused.
hypothetical
So you're saying,
experiments.
is it impossible to know whether under your view, do you think right now biologists could not run an experiment, a deconfounding experiment, where they're wondering if shiny beaks are conducive to fitness? You're saying that that's not possible.
You would have to test for every single possibility of any type of biological thing, that any type of toxin, any type of predation, all that kind of stuff, and every single abiotic one, which would be environmental, which would be any type of like, let's say that the shiny beak actually is a mechanism that creates and protects the beak against hot weather or something. And you don't, in your experiment,
yeah, but
in your experiment, you don't actually go up to the amount of temperature that is needed in order for that to be a beneficial trait in the population. You might have not done that.
You run an experiment to see if that's true, right?
No, because you can't do every single variable, man. It's not possible. And on top of that, you said that you wanted no genetic drift, no emigration, no DNA polymerase errors, no mutations. I mean, that's impossible. I mean, maybe with like a machine learning.
Then you're saying that biology is impossible.
What? No, man.
Because
no.
Look, we can run experiments to see whether traits are being selected for or not. And you're saying that you can't do that because there are too many uncontrolled variables.
No, this is what population genetics is. This is what the whole point of it is.
Okay,
this
so
is
then
what
what's
we're
the
doing.
issue? You can run an experiment,
yeah,
to see whether shiny beaks are conducive to fitness or not, right?
Yes.
Okay, and what you would expect is if they're not conducive to fitness, when you control for that, then you have a control and you have some set of finches that don't have shiny beaks. Okay, if there's no change in the allelic frequencies, then that would verify your hypothesis that the shiny beaks are likely don't contribute to fitness.
Okay, so what you would do, how you would test I'm telling you how you would do your experiment. You would take that gene that would actually make the beak shiny, and you would genetically modify the birds to knock that out. Okay, so that they wouldn't be shiny anywhere.
Huh? Why couldn't you just paint them dark?
Because like I said with the insect example, like genes can be used for different purposes. You don't have just like a gene that exists, like the heat shock proteins can be used to deal with toxins through mutations, all that kind of stuff. Your experiment, how you would do that is that you would take a bird, you genetically modify it to knock out that shiny beak example, and then
you don't need to do that.
Yes, you would. This is your experiment. I'm telling you how to do your experiment. Yes,
I'm painting the beaks.
No, you don't need. No, that is not how because DNA is the basis for all of these things that are being selected for. That is why we use it. Let me give you your example. Let me just give you your example so we can get to.
You're overcomplicating it, right?
No, we're not. This is how biology works, man. This is what it is. This is actually being a scientist.
No,
this is what it does.
I don't think you're understanding what my point is.
No,
right? The point is this: if I could, in an imaginary world, right, remove the large beaks and put really small beaks, we know that those birds would not be able to crack open the seeds, right?
Okay.
And if they can't crack open the seeds, then they don't get the nutritional value that they need to reproduce, right?
Okay, but there's niches other places in an environment.
I'm just talking about that island in the Galapagos.
There's lots of different niches in an environment in an island.
Look, was Darwin right that the large beaks were suitable for the environment where there were large seeds? Was he right about that?
All of them evolved to habitate their own niches in the environment.
Was he right about that?
I don't. That's what it is. The answer is that the size of the beaks it probably confers to the type of habitat that they do well in, and each of them are evolved to not compete directly with one another, so they're not directly going over
Darwin
the
was
exact
right.
same
You agree with
research.
Darwin that in the case where you had the specific islands that had larger seeds and you had larger beaks there, he thought that the larger beaks helped the finches open the larger seeds. Right? Was he was right about that. And so that just grounds a counterfactual, right? Where if those birds, if we remove the large beak and put a small beak on there, right, they would have trouble getting their nutrition, the necessary nutrition to reproduce. And you don't, I mean, that point is obvious, right? And I don't think Darwin was wrong about that, right? If he thought that. And in the same, now we can just think about shininess, right? So Darwin, if I ask Darwin, Darwin and I are looking at these finches, and I say, Darwin, if we could eliminate the shininess of the beak, do you think that the fitness would be impacted of these populations? He
But
said,
you're saying the
likely not.
fitness, but the fitness can be used for a lot of different ways. Again, this is how you test it. You would genetically modify to knock out the shininess, and then you would test that the wild type, the non-mutated birds versus the ones with the mutant knockout that doesn't have the shininess, and then you would expose them to environmental or other biological conditions and test the fitness. So we're talking about the fitness of them to be exposed at desiccation for hot weather, for example. You would look
It
at
doesn't
their
matter
different
how,
stuff. That's how
though,
you would
right?
test
Look,
it.
it doesn't matter how. We just know that if we magically replace the beaks with really small beaks, fitness would be impacted. We agree, right?
I don't know, man. I don't know if I agree with anything that you're
I don't know why
saying.
you wouldn't agree. That's what Darwin thought.
Dude, I don't care about Darwin as a biologist, man. I know that people think that scientists worship the shrine of Darwin, but he has zero impact on my actual day-to-day scientist as a scientist, man. Like, we've moved on
Who
past
discovered
Darwin.
natural selection? What are we
We've
critiquing?
completely moved on. Like, the theory of natural selection and evolution is not based off of Darwin, man. If you think so, I feel
It
really bad.
absolutely is.
No, it's not, dude.
It absolutely
Dude,
is.
this is before they even knew about DNA.
Doesn't mean there wasn't natural selection. Do you think Darwin knew what natural selection is?
Yes, an origin of species, yes, but
Okay,
that's not the
it's
basis of
irrelevant.
evolution. He doesn't. We're talking about DNA, and we're talking about DNA polymerase errors. We're talking about all this
That's
stuff
not
that
what
he
I'm
had
talking about. I'm
nobody.
just
Yes,
talking about
because I'm
natural
talking about
selection.
evolution. I'm talking about the actual thing that's happening.
I'm talking about natural selection.
Okay. Okay, you can talk about whatever you want. That's fine. I mean, but I'm talking about biology here. I'm talking about DNA. I'm talking about like nucleotides
I'm
and
talking
DNA
about natural
polymerase errors
selection.
and codon usage bias and all this kind of stuff. And that's what the problem is that you're not relating this back to actually how we modernly understand evolution, which is through DNA, and it's not through this phenotypic
Look, I've been trying
approach.
to explain to you a very basic concept in biology, the difference between a hitchhiker and a trait selected for. Most biologists, I've talked to many biologists. You're the first one that's given me pushback on this distinction. And I think you're the one that's ignorant of the literature in terms of what we would expect to happen if we removed a hitchhiker from a population. By definition, if it's a hitchhiker and removed it from the population, all else being equal, we shouldn't see an impact on allelic frequencies. I don't know any biologist. You're the first biologist that I know that is actually giving me pushback for this.
Oh, maybe that's the problem. Maybe you've had maybe that's the problem. I mean, I'm looking at the Goulds and Leotonin paper, and I'm reading the abstract, and it seems like they agree with me, man. So I don't know. Maybe you're,
I just
I'm reading the abstract. I'm reading the
what were
paper,
they
and they
saying?
agree with me. So I don't.
What did they say that's sympathetic to what you're saying? First of all, what do you think I'm saying about hitchhikers?
I think that you're saying that there's pieces of DNA that are in genomes.
Nope.
Okay, so we're not
I've never
talking about
even mentioned
DNA.
DNA. Here's what I'm
then what
saying
do we-
about hitchhikers. What is trait is hitchhiking? There's a counterfactual. If the hitchhiker was not present in the population, there would be no impact on fitness. That is how I'm defining a hitchhiker.
Yeah, and that hitchhiker is a gene, man, and it's a gene. Like it's a piece of DNA. Would you
Explained by a
agree?
gene. There's a difference between phenotype and genotype. The hitchhiker could be explained by a gene, right? The shininess is different than the gene that explains the shininess.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm talking about the shininess of a beak. If it is indeed a hitchhiking trait, then Had that trait not been there, there would have been there's no impact on fitness. That's what it means to be a hitchhiking trait.
But
That's
that
something
does
very basic in biology that
no man,
biologists
but
understand
because
today.
no, because there's things called like phenotypic elasticity where we know that maybe the phenotype isn't expressed during certain conditions and it is during others. Like we
I'm
know
telling you
that
about the
exists.
concept. I'm not talking about specific instances. I'm really just trying to illustrate the concept, and you're pushing back on the concept.
Yeah, because the premise is wrong.
What's the premise?
That there are hitchhiking traits that aren't connected to genes.
What's the difference between the hitchhiking trait and the trait that's being hitchhiked on? What's the conceptual difference?
One, I think that you're thinking. Well, I would think it would be one that's being expressed versus not one that has, but
They're
I
both
guess
being
not.
expressed.
Yeah, because you're not thinking about transcription and translation, and you're not thinking about DNA. So I don't know,
That's
dude.
irrelevant,
I don't know
right?
what you're
Again,
talking
can you
about.
just answer my question? Conceptually speaking, what's the difference between a hitchhiker trait and the trait that is getting hitchhiked? Conceptually.
Like I said, I would be thinking of DNA transcription, translation. I would be
know,
thinking
right?
about
We just
phenotypic
don't know.
elasticity. But what's your definition? I don't know. We're living in your world right now, dude. I have no idea what you're talking about.
I'm appealing to some of one of the most famous biologists for this distinction, right?
I mean,
Okay, so you're in
doesn't
your own
mean
world,
anything.
right? Just letting you know, you're in your own world, okay? Not me, right? I appealed to a paper that most biologists are sympathetic to, and you're in your own world, not me, okay? So the distinction between a hitchhiking trait and the trait that's being hitchhiked on, right, is that there's a counterfactual involved, right? Had the hitchhiker not been there, there would have not been a change in allelic frequency, all else being equal, okay? And if the trait that's getting hitchhiked is not there, then there's a counterfactual. If that trait ceases to exist in the population, there is going to be we would expect a change in allelic frequency. That's what it is, right? Do you understand that?
Why would it go away in your view?
Because
Where would it go? What happens to it?
Why would it go away? Well, I mean,
What happens? What are you talking about?
it's not
Alleles?
the
What are you
hitchhike.
talking
That's
about?
just what it
Alleles?
is.
What do you mean by
That's
alleles?
Do you understand the concept?
Are you talking about alleles? What are you talking about when you say
It
alleles?
doesn't matter, right?
Well,
I'm
it doesn't
telling you
matter
what
what
the
you're
concept-
talking about. What alleles mean? What do you mean
You
when you're
don't
talking about
know the
alleles? What are
difference.
alleles? What
You
are
don't know the
alleles?
difference.
I want you to
You don't
say
know the
DNA. I want you to say the words DNA.
What does that have to do with my point?
because man, this is the basis of mutations and evolution to natural selection. This is it.
What does that
You're
have to do with
talking
my
about
point? You're
allelic
just changing-
frequencies
you're
and stuff,
changing
and
the
you're saying
subject.
I didn't mention DNA at all.
Greg, you're changing the subject, right?
I'm not.
Let's just grant it to you. Let's say I'm an ignoramus about what DNA or transcription, translation, replication, codons, all of that shit, right? Let's just say I'm an ignoramus. It won't detract from the point I'm making to you, which is that there's a conceptual distinction between a trait that is a hitchhiker trait, and a trait that's being hitchhiked. There's a conceptual distinction there, and you're not getting it.
Well, I understand exactly what you're talking about, but I understand it in the
Say
framework of the
prove it.
genotype and all that kind of stuff, and you can't.
Then prove it. Prove it to me. What's the conceptual distinction?
I understand what you're saying in the fact that it's one that would be a trait that would be removed versus not. I understand what you're trying to say. But
Okay.
the actual molecular mechanisms that are actually happening in order for a trait to be removed are mutations that
that's
are
what I'm
accruing in
disputing.
that gene or the part of the genome to actually be removed. That's what I'm
What do you think
talking
I'm
about.
disputing?
What are you disputing?
You earlier said that all traits are being selected for. That's what you said earlier in this discussion. What that means is that there's a conceptual fallout between hitchhikers and traits that are being hitchhiked. That's the implication of your view. If every trait is being selected for, okay, that's to say every trait is conducive to fitness, then there is no conceptual distinction between hitchhiking traits and traits that are being selected for, or traits that are being hitchhiked. That is the entailment of your view. That is what I'm disputing. I'm not disputing the underlying genetic mechanisms for hitchhiking traits and traits that are being selected for. I can grant all of that information. That's not what I'm disputing.
Okay. So there's not a DNA genetic basis. It's just that these traits are magically showing up in the population and magically going away. That's what you're
That's not
saying.
what I said either.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. Because how are how are the
I
allelic
told you I can
frequencies
grant
going up?
the underlying mechanisms. Did you not hear me say,
You
fine, there
but
are underlying mechanisms to why there are these phenotypes, right? These, in other words, why there's a hitchhiker and why there's a trait of interest. Okay. That is not my contention with you. My contention is that there is a logical implication to the view that if you were to say every trait is being selected for, then there is no conceptual difference between a trait of interest and the trait that is being hitchhiked and the hitchhiker.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, so you take back the claim. You concede to the claim
No,
that not
I
every trait.
understand. I was trying to tell you your own
Okay,
view. But I again, we're living in like these hypothetical worlds, and I don't honestly.
I
I
told you from the very beginning that my issue with natural selection is conceptual in nature. I'm not disputing the empirical data. You've been just trying to give me empirical data.
Yeah,
I'm
and I've
fine with
been trying to
empirical
help you
data.
with experiments, actual experiments to try to help you understand it, and you've done nothing but
Understand
push me back.
what?
Put to push back on how to actually test if
You
these hitchhiking
understand?
genes would actually be necessary
Again,
and
I
would
have to
actually
say it
lead
again.
to allelic frequency fixation. I'm actually
I
trying
have
to
to say
help
it again.
you.
You understand that I'm not disputing the specific data that modern biologists have put forward.
Of course
That
you did.
is
You said that
not.
none of it mattered. When I gave you
It
mutations and
doesn't
stuff like
matter
that, you
because
said it didn't matter at all. You
my
said DNA and
issue
genomes and that all didn't matter. This is all just in this own world without mutations, without DNA polymerase errors, without immigration. You're not living in modern biology.
You understand that my contention is not with the empirical data that modern biologists put together.
Of
You
course it is,
understand
because you're
that, right?
throwing all of it out in
No,
order to
I'm
make
not.
your point.
Mm-mm.
Yes.
No, I'm fine with saying it's all true.
Well, I
Okay,
mean,
but
but you didn't
you see,
grant
I
any of
said
it
from
in
the
the
very
hypothetical,
beginning,
and you're not are okay with
Greg.
any
I said
experiments that actually live in the real world. So
I said from the very
then you're not
beginning.
granting any of it. You think it's all bad.
No, my issue is not with the empirical data that modern biologists put forward. You understand that, right? I'm not disputing any of your genetic information, whether it be about the polymerases, um, transcription, translation, any of that, right? I'm not contesting any of that. Okay. My issue with natural selection is purely conceptual. Okay. With the exception that biologists pretty much agree that there's a distinction between traits of interest and hitchhikers. That's the only, we have not even been able to get into the meat of Fodor's argument because you're not granting me this distinction between hitchhiker traits and non-hitchhiking traits.
Yeah, because this idea, you're kind of like in this world of like junk DNA. It's like this popular science kind of conception of what this stuff is in it, and it's not true. Like I remember like, oh, this, all these stories about junk DNA and all that kind of stuff being really popular, but that's just not how genetics is. That's not what actually happens. All that stuff, and we're finding and we're discovering new ways that actually those pieces of DNA are absolutely very important. So like, for example, long non-coding RNAs, microRNAs, silencing
Talking about right
RNAs.
now? How
These
does
are
that have
all
to do
things
anything
that have
with what
been
I'm
discovered
saying?
in the last 20 years, that these hitchhiking genes that might not be an advantage, that you might not think as an advantage, has a huge advantage through
Well,
evolution
they're not
and through natural
hitchhikers
selection.
then. Then they're not hitchhiking. You understand that?
Exactly. And you're
Yes.
right. So
But
you
I'm
agree with
talking about
me.
do you think there are hitchhikers at all?
I think that they're all selected for. Genomes are selected for, and
Well,
genes are
then there's no
selected
such thing
for.
as hitchhikers.
Agreed.
Okay. That
Everything
is
is
at
selected for.
odds that's at odds with the biological literature.
Okay,
Okay.
gold and leotonin, I don't agree with them. That's fine. I'm okay with that.
All right. I'm not interested in someone
They're
that's
my
not familiar with
colleagues,
the
bro.
biology.
I don't
I've just kicked you out, right? Because I'm not interested in talking to someone that's not familiar with the literature about hitchhikers. Biologists pretty much agree that there are traits that are not conducive to fitness, right? And so go educate yourself and then come back. All right?
Dude, how funny, man. Yeah, I mean, those are my colleagues, so I can make a critical review. I don't agree with everything that is. I want to watch this though. I want to see what he's saying. This is so funny. Good one. This guy has no idea what he's talking about. Oh, okay. So he had no. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I don't bend the knee to like some random paper that he's gonna find in. Yeah, sorry. These are my colleagues, so I can make just as they're not. Let's actually look at the paper. Let's actually look at the paper. What he was not willing to do. Let's actually look at the paper. And I can show why they were actually agreeing with me, and he has a bad reading or something. I wanted to actually get to the paper. I was trying to read the paper, but he didn't want to do that because he wants to push this weird false narrative about what he thinks natural selection is in this vacuum without any type of one second, sorry. Let's see here. Sorry, one second. Okay, let's see if I can turn on my cam. Sorry, I wasn't prepared for this. I want to actually go through the here we go. I want to go through the actual paper that he was afraid to actually go over, and he wanted to just kick me out for some reason because he thought that he was making a good point, but that wasn't true. That's just not true. One second. I'm sorry. I wasn't prepared for this. Let's see here. But the idea that like biologists and scientists don't have any contentions and they don't disagree on things is hilarious to me. So he obviously has a skewed fusion of what he thinks science is. So that's fine with me. Damn it, what was it? I'm trying to find that paper. I mean, I don't know who he's talking to that he thinks has, that's like the, but that's man, that is what all scientists do. They disagree about things. So that's what we do, man. That's what we do. And those are my colleagues. They're not my arbiters of truth. I don't need to just listen to them and bend the knee. So I apologize if you thought that's what I was going to do, but that's just not how it happens because I'm a scientist and I don't do that. So, all right, let's go through the paper here. If this is the paper that he's actually thinking about, like this is pretty funny because I was reading the paper as we were going along, and I was like, I wanted to go through it because I felt like he actually was making my point. So I don't understand what the point he was making because he didn't want to make any points. He wanted to make and work in these hypotheticals that don't exist in the real world. So that's what I don't understand. Okay, here we go. The spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossium paradigm. All right. A critique of adaptionist program by Gould and Leotonin. An adaptionist program has dominated evolutionary thought in England and the United States during the past 40 years. It is based on the faith in the power of natural selection as an optimizing agent. It proceeds by breaking an organism into unitary traits and proposing an adaptive story for each considered separately. Yeah, exactly. They're not considered separately. This is what I was saying, that they agree with me, that they're taken by their entirety through their genome. So there it is. Trade-offs among competing selective demands exert the only brake upon perfection. Non-optimality is thereby rendered as a result of adaptation as well. We criticize this approach and attempt to reassert a competing notion, long popular in continental Europe, that organisms must be analyzed as integrated wholes. That's what I was talking about with the genotype, everything going together. We criticize this approach and attempt to reassert a competing notion that organisms must be analyzed as integrated wholes. That's exactly what I was saying, that their genotypes are important and they are all selected for. Who doesn't understand the literature one more time here? With bowel plane as so constrained by phyletic heritage, pathways of development, and general architecture that the constraints themselves become more interesting and more important in delimiting pathways of change than the selective force that may mediate change when it occurs. What are they trying to say here? We criticize this approach and attempt to reassert the competing notion that organisms must be analyzed as integrated wholes. I don't know what bowel plane is. With bowel plane so constrained by phyletic heritage, pathways of development and general architecture that the constraints themselves become more interesting and more important in delimiting pathways of change than the selective force that may mediate change when it occurs. This is what I was saying, that the push for natural selection to happen on the entire genotype, which is what all the genes, the holistic approach, is that it's pushing that selective force. I was pushing that. That's what I was saying. We fault the adaptationist program. That was him. He was saying that they can adapt because of these traits, that they don't have to lose traits or genes. They can lose traits, gain and lose traits willy-nilly without any type of genes that can be changed. No DNA polymerase errors. I don't understand what he was trying to say there. We fault the adaptationist program for its failures to distinguish current utility for the reason from reasons for origin. We fault the adaptationist program for its failure to distinguish current utility from reasons for origin. Male tyrannosaurs may have used their diminutive front legs to titillate female partners, but this will not explain why they got so small. So again, there might be some type of fitness advantage that we don't know about here that might give them an evolutionary fitness. That's exactly what we're saying. Okay, for its unwillingness to consider alternatives to adaptive stories. That's what I was trying to say with the shiny beak could actually give some type of fitness advantage. For its unwillingness to consider, I'll adjust your comment 1 second. I just want to get through the abstract. And its failure to consider adequately such competing themes as random fixation of alleles, production of non-adaptive structures by developmental correlation with selective features. That's what I was saying. For its failure to consider adequately such competing themes as random fixation of alleles, that's what I was saying, that these things, these genes, might actually be being used in ways that we can't test in these hypotheticals, right, that he was talking about. And these are the molecular mechanisms for this. So at this time, I mean, you have to think about in 79, so they have DNA, they have nucleotides, they have the structure of DNA now, but they don't understand population genetics like we do. So these are ways that these genes can kind of go through. The separability of adaptation and selection, okay, that's again what I was talking about, that selection, natural selection versus that adaptation that can just lose or gain alleles, multiple adaptive peaks. That's again what I was talking about with the different types of mutations with the codons, and current utility as an epiphenomenon. Okay, epiphenomenon of non-adaptive structures. Okay, again, genes, proteins, they have utility outside of their given purpose. I said that multiple times. We support Darwin's own pluralistic approach to identifying the agents of evolutionary change. The pluralistic, holistic approach. This is exactly what I was talking about. This is why I wanted to focus on the papers. He is not a biologist, so I wanted to talk to and respond to articulated arguments that I could actually understand as a biologist, and that's why I wanted to focus on this paper. I brought it up multiple times. I said let's I gave him the link, and it's very frustrating that we didn't get to go over that. I was pushing for that, but okay. I don't dislike talking to philosophical people. I'm totally okay with giving hypotheticals, and I gave him multiple hypothetical experiments that he would have to do in order to make his point there. So I was the one that was actually engaging in the hypothetical. It's that he had these weird abstractions that were just not grounded in anything that we wanted. And the problem is giving him any type of leeway on that was the next step was, okay, so now this is a hitchhiking gene that doesn't have any purpose, that is just there. And it's like, well, no, we said that this only existed and was okay in a hypothetical we were talking about of no DNA polymerase errors, no type of emigration or immigration, no type of natural selection that he said was going to go on for generations. I mean, it's literally impossible to do the experiments because there's evolution is going to happen. Mutations are going to accrue in the population, and there's going to be natural selection that happens. So in every single long-term evolutionary experiment, we don't rule those out. That's what we're studying. And that's what my frustration was when he was saying, we have to rule out all that stuff. And it's like, no, dude, that's exactly what science is. That's what we're studying when we're studying evolution. I don't know. It's interesting that he holds this paper in such high esteem. Again, I think that it actually agrees with me on my point of view. We can go through the entire paper. I think I should, because this was like his thing that he wanted to cite. So I'm going to read the entire paper. So let's do it. All right. All right. Again, so the abstract agrees with me. So this is why I was reading the abstract and I'm like, is this the paper that you want to cite? Like, this is not one, it's super old. I mean, so in biology, like 10 years is kind of pushing it. Back to 79 is very old. And because they don't have, like, notice in this paper, for example, they don't have any experimental evidence, and that's tough. That wouldn't fly. You wouldn't be able to put this in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, for example, which is the modern, or even the Royal Society for Publishing in the UK. You wouldn't be able to do that because they require some type of evidence now. Okay, so this great central dome of St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice presents in its mosaic design a detailed iconography expressing the mainstays of Christian faith. 3 circles of figures radiate out from the central image of Christ, angels, disciples, and virtues. Each circle is divided into quadrants, even though the dome itself is radially symmetrical in structure. Each quadrant meets one of the 4 spandrels in the arches below the dome. Spandrels, the tapering triangular spaces formed by the intersection of the 2 rounded arches at right angles. I'm totally lost here. Are necessary architectural byproducts of the mounting a dome on these rounded arches. Okay, so they're saying that these things wouldn't necessarily be inside the dome, but they're necessary in order to be there. Each spandrel contains a design admirably fitted into its tapering space. An evangelist sits in the upper part, flanked by the heavenly cities. Below, a man representing one of the 4 biblical rivers pours water from the pitcher into the narrowing space below its feet. The design is so elaborate, harmonious, and purposeful that we are tempted to view it as the starting point of any analysis, as the cause in some sense of the surrounding architecture. But this would invert the proper faith of analysis. Okay, I don't know what they're saying there. The system begins with an architectural constraint, the necessary 4 spandrels, and their tapering triangular form. They provide a space in which the mosaics worked. They set the quadruped symmetry of the dome above. Okay, so one wouldn't say that you could just remove these parts. What they're saying here is that this is all part of it. You wouldn't think that these little bits contribute to the whole thing, but they are. Just like those hitchhiking genes, they're necessary, even though they're selected for. So again, anyway, such architectural constraints abound, and we find them easy to understand because we do not impose our biological biases upon them. Every fan vaulted ceiling must have a series of open spaces along the midline of the vault where the sides of the fans intersect between the pillars. Figure 2. Okay. All right. Since the spaces must exist, they are often used for ingenious ornamental effect. Okay. In King's College Chapel in Cambridge, for example, the spaces contain bosses alternatively embellished with the Tudor rose and the portcullis. In a sense, this design represents an adaptation, but the architectural constraint is clearly primary. Okay. So they're saying that there seems to be extra spaces that don't really that are changed because of the dome feature, but they're there secondarily, which is his hitchhiking example. The spaces arise as a necessary byproduct of the fan vaulting. This appropriate use is a secondary effect. Okay, so anyone who tried to argue that the structure exists because the alteration of rows and portcullis makes so much sense in a Tudor chapel would be inviting the same ridicule that Voltaire heaped upon Dr. Pangloss. Things cannot be other than they are. Everything is made for the best purpose. Our noses were made to carry spectacles, so we have spectacles. Legs were clearly intended for breeches, and we wear them. Yet evolutionary biologists, and their tendency to focus exclusively on immediate adaptation to local conditions, do tend to ignore architectural constraints and perform such an inversion of the explanation. That's what he's talking about with the hitchhiker genes. This is exactly they're giving a counterfactual. They're saying why it's wrong in this paper. This is his paper that he thinks is so important. Yet evolutionary biologists tend to focus on the immediate adaptation. That's his point. Oh, this is not necessary, so you're going to lose that trait. He's only thinking about phenotypes here. And this is exactly what they're talking about. That's so funny. This is his paper. This is his paper that he booted me from stream for not having I've read, because I haven't read all of biology work in the last 50 years. But this is true. I think my own thoughts. But that's so funny. This is exactly evolutionary biologists and their tendency to focus exclusively on immediate adaptation to local conditions. It's exactly what he was saying, because he thought that the traits were hitchhiking because they were gone or away because of the allelic frequency going to fixation, as he put it. It's very, very frustrating that he was talking about alleles, but he wouldn't actually mention genotypes, and he doesn't really care about them actually in the terms of natural selection and evolution. Very crazy. As a closer example, Recently featured in some important biological literature on adaptation, anthropologist Michael Herner has proposed in 1977 that Aztec human sacrifice arose as a solution to chronic shortage of meat. Limbs of victims were often consumed, but only by people of high status. E.O. Wilson in 1978 was used as explanation as a primary illustration as an adaptive genetic disposition for carnivory in humans. Harner and Wilson ask us to view an elaborate social system and a complex set of illicit justifications involving myth, symbols, and tradition as mere phenomena generated by the Aztecs as an unconscious rationalization masking the real reason for it all, the need for protein. But Shaalin's 1978 has argued that human sacrifice represented just one part of the elaborate cultural fabric that, in its entirety, not only represented the material expression of Aztec cosmology, but also performed such utilitarian functions as the maintenance of social ranks and systems of tribute among cities. Okay, this is like a lot of anthropology here. Okay, so they're saying that there's things that are tied to events that might not be necessarily the first impression, which is kind of like what I was talking about with these shiny beaks, his shiny beak example, the thing that he just wouldn't stop thinking about. We strongly suspect that Aztec cannibalism was an adaptation, much like evangelists and rivers and spandrels or ornamental Boston ceiling spaces, a secondary epiphenomenon representing a fruitful yet use of available parts, not a cause of the entire system. To put it crudely, a system developed for other reasons generated an increasing number of fresh bodies. Wow. use might as well be made of them. All right. Why invert the whole system in such a curious fashion and view an entire culture as the epiphenomenon of an unusual way to beef up the meat supply? Spandrels do not exist to house the evangelists. Okay. So they're saying that the architecture wasn't created around the painting, right? The painting was made around the architecture. Man, I'm trying to there's a lot of, I don't understand why there's okay, we can just skip that part because it's a lot of anthropology. We deliberately chose non-biological examples in a sequence running from remote to more familiar, architectural to anthropology. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Man, if only I could write intros like this. This is just unbelievable. We did this because the primacy of architectural constraint and the epiphenomenal nature of adaptation are not obscured by biological prejudices in these examples. But we trust that the message for biologists will not go unheeded. If these had been biological systems, would we not, by the force of habitat, have regarded the epiphenomenal adaptation as primary and tried to build the whole structural system from it? Okay, so yeah, they're saying that structure was first, then it was painted, not the other way around. I've never heard of this paper before, Shannon. I don't get that. I don't hold anything against them. I think that is just again another misunderstanding of evolution versus natural selection, and it's okay. It's again, man. Honestly, I feel like it's actually biologists that failed him, not him, because again. We should have been better at teaching this stuff, and his high school biology teachers, maybe college biology, if you took intro to biology, didn't do a good enough job actually explaining what evolution and natural selection is. Anyone that thinks that this is all happening outside of the guise of DNA in the 2000s is unbelievable. He's literally, no wonder he puts Darwin on such a high pedestal, because he's literally using that as the premise for all this stuff. So I have nothing, I hold no ill will against the guy. Okay, here we go. The adaptationist program. We wish to question a deeply ingrained habit of thinking among students of evolution. That's what I was just talking about. Let's go. Let's see how we agree here. We call it the adaptationist program, or the Panglossian paradigm. All right, I've never heard of that one. So I guess they've failed in the 20 years after they wrote this paper to establish this paper as the paradigm, but they got one. They got one person. It is rooted in a notion popularized by A.R. Wallace and A. Weisman. I don't know. But not, as we shall see, by Darwin. Interesting. It is a notion popularized by A.R. Wallace and A. Weisman, but not, as we shall see, by Darwin, towards the end of the 19th century. The near impotence of natural selection in forging organic design and fashioning the best among possible worlds. Interesting. The program regarded natural... interesting. Yeah, it's exactly. It's odd for me to think that he thought that these traits could go in or out of the population, but that he granted all of the genetics and the molecular biology and stuff like that, but he can't use that in order to build the example that he's talking about. He can't. In my opinion, you can't grant that, but then also discount it all in all of your experiments. Oh, we are talking shiny beaks. We are talking about shiny beaks all night. Okay, this program regards natural selection as so powerful and the constraints upon it so few that direct production of adaptation through its operation becomes the primary cause for nearly all organic form, function, and behavior. I'm confused. They call it, we wish to question a deeply ingrained habit, of thinking among students. Okay. This program regards natural selection as so powerful and the constraints upon it so few that direct production of adaptation through its operation becomes the primary cause for all organic form, function, and behavior. Yeah, it's not natural selection. That's the thing I was trying to talk about. It's evolution too. It's the mutations. It's not just natural selection. He was only thinking about that. I was trying to bring him back to earlier parts in the in the process to try to ground a little bit more. That's what the whole point of the DNA mutation experiments that I was talking to him about. I don't understand. I think this is interesting. Okay, constraints upon the perversive power of natural selection are recognized, of course. Okay, phyletic inertia primarily among them, although immediate architectural constraints, as discussed in the last section, are rarely acknowledged. Phyletic inertia. I don't understand how phyletic inertia leads to immediate architectural strength. I don't understand that. But they are usually dismissed as unimportant, or else more frustratingly simply acknowledged and then not taken to heart and evoked. Exactly, except for the shiny beaks. Studies on shiny beaks. No, just kidding. It's okay. He was trying to, that was an example that he understood and that he was trying to use, so it's okay. Studies under the adaptationist program generally proceed in two ways. Okay, an organism is atomized into traits, and these traits are explained as structures optimally designed by natural selection for their functions. For lack of space, we omit an extended discussion of the vital issue. What is a trait? Some evolutionists may regard this as trivial or merely semantic problem. It is not. Organisms are integrated entities, not collections of discrete objects. That's what I was talking about with the beaks. That's what I was talking about. Are integrated entities. They're integrated. Their entire genomes are integrated into one. We can't just only talk about their beaks. We have to. They're bringing lots of different things. This hitchhiking gene idea that would be only construed, and the trait would only be selected for, but then the DNA. He was kind of saying it with the fixation of the allelic frequency, but I don't think that he understood what that meant. I really don't. He kept saying that and repeating that, but I don't think that he understood what that meant. Okay. Organisms are integrated entities, not collections of discrete objects. Evolutionists have often led astray by inappropriate atomization. Yes, dude. That I totally agree. He's atomizing this beak, to only the shininess of the beak, as if it's just that, and it's not. It has a lot to do with other things. Our favorite examples involve the human chin. Oh man, that he used that example. Man, he really likes this paper. Is this really? Man, who are these guys? Gould and Leotonin. I'm not. I've heard their names, but I haven't really like read them. If we regard the chin as a thing rather than as a product of interaction between two growth fields, alveolar and mandibular, then we are led to an interpretation of its origin exactly opposite to the one generally favored, neotonic. What? I don't understand this. I don't want to. I exactly, dude. I want to. He kept talking about alleles and then saying discounting DNA and then talking about alleles, and I was like, bro, you have like, what do you mean? What are you talking about when you're talking about allelic frequencies? Like, he doesn't know. He didn't know what that was, so it's okay, dude. We failed him. We have failed. This channel. I will say, this channel exactly exists in order to try to reach people like that, who they're interested in science, but they have kind of like a misunderstanding the cheat teachings, and their classes have kind of failed them in having like a full understanding of like what science is. And I think I didn't get him as a subscriber tonight, but I hope that people like him would be interested in watching. Oh man. Okay. I left off. Okay. The notion. Okay. After the failure of part by part optimization, interaction is acknowledged via the dictum that an organism cannot optimize each part without imposing expenses on others. Interaction is acknowledged via the dictum that an organism can't optimize each part without imposing expenses on the other. The notion of trade-off is introduced, and the organisms are interpreted as best compromises among competing demands. That's what he was talking about, the beaks. Oh my gosh, that's so crazy. He's misinterpreting this paper. He's misinterpreting this paper. This is really interesting. This is funny reading this as a biologist, and I understand what they're trying to say, and I think that I can understand why where he went wrong. Interesting. The notion of trade-off is introduced, and organisms are interpreted as best compromising among the competing demands. That's so interesting, because that's what he was talking about with the beak, right? That's what he was saying. He was saying the beak could be painted or not painted, and that trade-off of having the beak is then what we are selecting for, or we are looking for, and that's the best compromise, and that's so funny. Thus, interaction among parts is retained completely within the adaptationist program. Any suboptimality of a part is explained as its contribution to the best possible design for the whole. Any suboptimality of a part is explained as its contribution to the best possible design for the whole. Okay, any suboptimality in the beak thing that he was talking about, the shiny beak, is explained as its contribution to the best possible design for the whole. The notion that suboptimality might represent anything other than the immediate work of natural selection is usually not entertained. That's exactly what he's talking about. This is insanity. Reading this is so funny. I wish I had read this before. I wish I would have read this before, but he didn't give me anything, right? We were just like, I was listening to his talk, and like, the notion that suboptimality might represent anything other than the immediate work of natural selection is not entertained. It's exactly what he was talking about with the painting the beaks. Painting the beaks. That's exactly what he was talking about. That's so interesting, because that's what I was saying, that the junk DNA that's kind of like an old notion that we don't really understand anymore as being true. That's wrong. That was an old notion, and we don't really see that anyway. As Dr. Panglis said in explaining to candidate why he suffered from venereal disease, it is indispensable in this best of worlds. For if Columbus, when visiting the West Indies, had not caught this disease, which poisons the source of generation, which frequently even hinders generation, and is clearly opposed but to the great end of nature, we should have we would have neither chocolate or cochineal. It sounds like a you problem, bro. The adaptationist program is truly Panglossian. Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, it's like the beak has to be something that is they deal with, or the trait of the, oh my God, the trait of the glossiness goes away. It's not fixated. The alleles aren't fixated in the population, as he would have said. Oh my God. Our world may not be good in an abstract sense, but it is the best we could have. Each trait plays its part and must be as it is. Is this a psyop? Is this, I am so, like, what is going on? That's exactly what I was saying. Each trait plays its part and must be as it is, because that's been what it was evolved and it's not selected for. It was a little weird. At this point, some evolutionists will protest that we are caricaturing their view as adaptation. After all, do not admit genetic drift, allometry, and a variety of reasons for non-adaptive evolution. They do, to be sure, but we make a different point. In natural history, all possible things happen sometimes. You generally do not support your favorite phenomenon by declaring rivals impossible in theory. That's what I was saying with the, oh my God, the beak being, it's not black or shiny, man. There's a lot of different things that are happening at the genetic level. They're all being selected for. It's not, these genes don't come as just a single thing. Rather, you acknowledge the rival, but circumscribe its domain of action so narrowly that it cannot have any importance in the affair of nature. But, oh my God, but rather you acknowledge the rival, but circumscribe its domain of action so narrowly, the beak, shininess, right? The shininess of the beak, whether or not it's shiny or not, so narrowly that it cannot have any importance on the affairs of nature. That's what I was saying with the desiccation and the temperature and all the different ways that it might actually be good. This is exactly what I was saying. This is a psyop, man. There's no way, dude. Then you often congratulate yourself for having such an undogmatic and ecumenical chat. We maintain the alternatives to selection for best overall design have generally been regulated to unimportance by this mode of argument. Okay. We maintain the alternatives to selection. Oh, that's so funny. Oh my gosh, that is so he took this thing the entire wrong way. Have we not all heard the catechism about genetic drift? It can only be an importance in populations so small that they are likely to become extinct before playing any sustained evolutionary role. What? That's this reminds me of this conversation because the guy's trying to discount genetic drift, saying that there's no without biology experiments, without mutations, that's impossible. That's literally impossible, man. You can't have DNA polymerase cannot be perfect. I'm sorry. I guess in a thought experiment, I was saying with like a computer science, like maybe like a computer science program but that's not, we're not talking about reality here. The admission of alternatives and principles does not imply their serious consideration in daily practice. We all say that not everything is adaptive. Yeah. Okay. Yet faced with an organism, we tend to break it into parts and tell adaptive stories as its trade-off among competing. Well-designed parts are the only constraint upon perfection for each trait. It is an old habit. As Romanes complained about A.R. Wallace in 1900, Mr. Wallace does not expressly maintain the abstract impossibility of laws and causes rather than those of utility and natural selection. Nevertheless, as we nowhere recognize any other law or cause, he practically concludes that or inductive or empirical grounds, there is no such other law or cause to be entertained. I don't understand that part at all, to be honest with you. I'm really confused at that. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't get that paragraph. The adaptionist program can be traced through common styles of argument. We illustrate just a few. We trust they will be recognized by all. Oh my God. If they talk about Darwin's finches here, I'm gonna bust. If adaptive argument fails, try another. I know, right? I want beaks so bad in these examples. There's 4. Damn, I don't think we get beaks. Okay. If one adaptive argument fails, he kept trying all these different things, Zigzag commissars of clams and brachiopods, once widely regarded as devices for strengthening the shell, become sieves for restrictive particles upon a given size. Exactly. There are different ways of using a trait that they think that might be, oh my God, I am going crazy here. This is insane. A suite of external structures, horns, antlers, tucks, once viewed as weapons against predators, become symbols of intraspecific competition among males. Exactly. They can have different purposes, different uses. Oh my God, I am going crazy. Okay, he was debating me on the natural selection as a philosophical concept. He agrees with it as like biologically, apparently. I don't understand that. But this was the paper that he was citing as like, this is the guy that this is the paper. Like I said that I hadn't read this paper and he was aghast. Like I can't believe that you haven't read this paper. And I'm like, what? And then while he was berating me about the existence of hitchhiker genes, I said, no, I don't. I started reading this and I started seeing some of the abstracts and stuff, and I'm reading it going like, dude, this kind of disagrees with me. What is he talking about? So I'm so confused. The Eskimo face, does not age well. Does not age well. The Eskimo face, once depicted as cold engineered, becomes an adaptation to generate and withstand large masticatory forces. That is not. We do not attack those with newer interpretations. They all might be right. We do wonder, though, whether the failure of one explanation should always simply inspire a search for another of the same general form, rather than a consideration of alternatives to the proposition that each part is for some specific purpose. So this is what I was talking about, in that they're still being evolved for. They're still being selected for in the genome with phenotypic elasticity. Part of the genome might, a part of the genome might work for the slipperiness of the beak, but it also might be for the production of some type of chemical that is used for like feathers, for example, to keep them oil tight so that they can dive or something as a bird or something like that. So there's like lots of different ways. You can't just knock out one thing and just to say that it's only going to have an impact on the just on the beak itself, just on food. And that's what he was talking about, like with the sizes of the finch, the sizes of the beak. Oh, you have a big beak and a small beak. And it's like, well, no, dude, there's going to be a lot of different things that are going to change now. You're going to have a diet. You're going to have a specific microbiome. You're going to have a different beak size. You're going to have to have intestinal lengths. You're going to have a different beak selection. So there's lots and lots of different things that are going to have to be changed. You can't just, oh my gosh. I feel like I'm being gaslit, dude. We should do beak genetics. I think we should. Everyone should be beaked. If one adaptive argument fails, assume that another must exist, a weaker version of the first argument. That's what I was talking about. Like, you could just lose that portion of the genome. If you don't need that beak of the slipperiness and it's no longer necessary, you could just lose it. There isn't going to be a portion of the genome that isn't going to just stick around just because. There's going to be some in a population. There's going to be some birds, right, that have lost that part of their genome. Some that do still have it. So if there's a natural selection, there's going to be a speciation event with those that have that beak and those that don't have that beak. That's just how natural selection works. If one adaptive argument fails, assume that another one exists, a weaker version of the first argument. This is what he was talking about, the slipperiness with the beak and the blackness, the black beaks. Costa and Bissell, for example, hoped to find a correlation between genetic polymorphisms and stability of the environment in the deep sea, but they failed. What? Dude, that is they try to. That's so funny. In 1978, looking for a GWAS, a genome-wide association study. There has to be something. Oh my God. Okay. A weaker version of the first argument. Costa and Bissell, for example, hoped to find a correlation between genetic polymorphism and stability of the environment in the deep sea, but they failed. They conclude in 1978 the degree of genetic polymorphisms found would seem to indicate absence of correlation with the particular environmental factors which characterize the sampled area. The results suggest that the adaptive strategies of organisms belonging to different phyla are different. Yeah, exactly. There's going to be a lot of, and their genomes are going to adapt and be, oh man, this is so nutty. I can't imagine having a conversation with someone about evolution and not talking about DNA. That's what I just had. Oh my gosh. I had a conversation with someone that was arguing whether or not genes were the unit of heredity that made more sense than what his argument was. That was insane. Okay, 3. In the absence of good adaptive argument in the first place, attribute failure to imperfect understanding of where an organism lives and what it does. That's what he was talking about. With the freaking beaks and the islands, man. That's so funny. This is, again, an old argument. Consider, yes, in the absence of good adaptive argument in the first place, attribute failure to an imperfect understanding of where the beak lives and does. Yes. You can't just because there's a beak size, for example, I mean, we don't know things in 100%, right? We don't know. He's a master's in philosophy. That's his degree. I don't know why he is taking akin to trying to understand evolution or natural selection, but sure did try. In the absence of good adaptive argument in the first place, attribute failure to imperfect understanding of where an organism lives and what it does. This is again an old argument. Consider Wallace on why all details of color and form in land snails must be adaptive, even if different animals seem to inhabitate the same environment. Yeah. On why all details of color and form in land snails must be adaptive, even if different animals seem to inhabit the same environment. The exact proportions of the various species of plants, the numbers of each kind of insect or bird, the peculiarities of more or less exposure to sunshine or to wind at certain critical epochs. That's exactly what I'm saying. Phenotypic elasticity. That's so crazy. And other slight differences, which to us are absolutely immaterial and unrecognizable, may be the highest significance to these humble creatures and be quite sufficient and will require some slight adjustments of size, form, or color, which natural selection will bring about. That's what I was saying. This is my problem. I wasn't able to talk about this in a way that he could understand. I was really trying to give examples and stuff and try to walk through the mechanisms. That exactly, this is exactly right. Because we can't construe all the different variables in our experiments. We can't figure them out and we can't test for all of them. What we do in biology is take it down to genes, knock out those genes, and then test that for a specific thing, a specific fitness event, and then monitor that. The exact proportions of this is so true. The exact proportions of the various species of the plants, numbers of kind of each of insect or bird, the peculiarities, more or less exposure to sunshine or to wind or certain critical epochs, the other slight differences which to us are absolutely immaterial and unrecognizable. Exactly. There might be things that we don't know about yet. May be of the highest importance. That piece of DNA that we don't think is immaterial, that trait that we think is immaterial and unrecognizable, may be the highest significance to those humble creatures. That's exactly what they're saying, and be quite significant and sufficient to require some slight adjustments of sign. That's phenotypic elasticity. I was trying to say that. I know, man. I was trying to bring it back. I don't understand. He was so hung up on this hitchhiker gene. I honestly wonder, like, what is that even? I'm really curious. I don't even. I mean, he's not talking about like actual. This is really frustrating. Okay, we'll go through this. We'll go through that afterwards. Okay. Because he's not talking about hitchhiking genes and the DNA thing. He's talking about traits. So this is a certain trait. He's not linking it back to DNA. He's not linking it back to anything. But there is some type of way that things are moved around. He's not talking about transposons, okay? He's not talking about like transduction of, localized transduction where pieces of DNA are moved around and that are hitchhiking around on virus particles because of, recombination events that happen. So that's what I'm trying to understand what he's trying to talk about. He's not talking about DNA or anything that's actually what it is. He was talking about these weird phenotypes that are showing up and not showing up, and he refused to say what happened after those allele frequencies or fixed. What happens to the other ones? That's what I was trying to understand. What happens to those other allele frequencies that happen in the population? He was so focused on the one that was going to fixation. In his mind, all the genes are all there because of that. And that's not true. There's a lot of genetic mutations and genes that exist in a population that are going to be necessary. Because I was trying, I did. I went through a lot of his examples. I was trying to give him actual answers on how you would test that, on how you would actually learn what he was saying. I would say the opposite. He wasn't giving me any consolations. The problem is I was walking him through his thought experiments, and I was giving him everything, man. He wouldn't even let me he didn't let me finish like my actually testing whether or not the slipperiness of the beak was related to fitness. He was in his mind, it's either you paint the shininess black and that's what it is, versus there's no other considerations through genetic means and through knockout experiments, which is, that's crazy. That's crazy. Exactly. He wasn't asking for answers. That's a great way to put it. 4, emphasize immediate utility and exclude other attributes of form. Oh my God. That's exactly what I was saying, dude. This is nuts. This is the paper that he thinks that since I didn't read, he thought that this disagreed and debunked everything that I said, by the way. And this is the thing that since I didn't read it, he kicked me off. The premise though, the problem is the premise, man. Like the premise, I was going through his thing, I was going through it, and the premise of his entire argument was wrong. That's the problem. Okay. Emphasize immediate utility and excludes other attributes of form. Fully half the explanatory information accompanying the full-scale fiberglass Tyrannosaurus at Boston Museum of Science reads, front legs a puzzle. How Tyrannosaurus used its tiny front legs is a scientific puzzle. They were too short even to reach the mouth. They may have been used to help the animal rise from a lying position. We don't doubt that Tyrannosaurus is used. We don't doubt that the Tyrannosaurus used its diminutive front legs for something. If they had arisen de novo or anew, we would encourage the search for some immediate adaptive reason. But they are, after all, the reduced product of conventionally functional homologs in ancestors, longer limbs of Allosaurus, for example. As such, we do not need an explicitly adaptive explanation for the reduction itself. It is likely to be a developmental correlate of allometric fields for relative increase in head and hind limb size. This non-adaptive hypothesis can be tested by conventional allometric methods. Okay. And seems to us both more interesting and fruitful than the untestable speculations based on secondary utility in the best of both worlds. One must not confuse the fact that a structure is used in some way, consider again the squandrels, ceiling spaces, and Aztec bodies, with the primary evolutionary reason for its existence in conformation. Oh my God, this is insanity. So yeah, again, finches. We're talking about his example was like finches and the size and the shininess of the beak. One must not confuse the fact that a structure is used in some way, the shininess of the beak, the length of the beak, consider with the primary evolutionary reasons for its existence in conformation. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. Telling stories. Oh my gosh, this is so much. You have so much left. Okay. We're going through it. I don't care. Telling stories. All this is a manifestation of the rightness of things. Since there is a volcano of Lisbon, it cannot be anywhere else, for it's impossible for things to be where they are because everything is for the best. Dr. Pangloss of the Great Lisbon Earthquake of 1750, of which 50,000 people lost their lives. We would not object so strenuously to the adaptationist program in its innovation in any particular case would lead in principle to its rejection for want of evidence. We might still view it as a restrictive and object. We might still view it as restrictive and object to its status as an argument of first choice, but it could be dismissed after failing some explicit tests. Then alternatives could get their chance. Like the shininess of the beak. That's exactly what it is. Unfortunately, a common procedure among evolutionists does not allow such definable rejection for two reasons. First, the rejection of one adaptive story usually leads to its replacement by another, rather than to a suspicion that a different kind of explanation might be required. First, the rejection of one adaptive story, the shininess of the beak, usually leads to replacement by the other, the black beak thing, rather than a suspicion that a different kind of explanation might be required. Exactly. Since the range of adaptive stories is as wide as our minds are fertile, no stories can always be postulated. And if a story is not immediately available, one can always plead temporary ignorance and trust that it will be forthcoming, as did Costa and Bissell, cited above. Secondly, the criteria for acceptance of a story are so loose that many pass without proper confirmation. Often, evolutionists use consistency with natural selection of the sole criterion and consider their work done as they concoct a plausible story. But plausible stories can be always told. The key to historical research lies in devising criteria to identify proper explanations among the substantial set of plausible pathways to any modern result. So exactly, any story could be made on why there is something a certain way, but how we test these things are through exact methods, right? Knocking the gene out, testing it, seeing how it works. You have to test it. these are all thought experiments, and too much of the discussion was all in these thought experiments. But we can test things. We don't have to just exist in these hypothetical worlds. We can actually test things in biology. We have, for example, and that's one of the reasons why, by the way, biology is such an interesting and fun field to research in, because you get all these things that are related to one another that you wouldn't necessarily think that, they are correlated. And that's the whole reason why we do these experiments. That's why it's such a fun field versus like physics or chemistry, for example, that has more known what's going on, right? Now, through biology, there is a huge question mark. This is called the biological black box amongst scientists. We have, for example, Gould, 1978, criticizing Barash's 1976 work on aggression in mountain bluebirds for this reason. Barash mounted a stuffed male near the nests of 2 pairs of bluebirds while the male was out foraging. He did this at the same nest at 3 different occasions at 10-day intervals. The first before eggs were laid, the last 2 afterwards. He then counted aggressive approaches of the returning male towards both the model and the female. At one time, aggression was high towards the model and lower towards the females, but substantial in both nests. Aggression towards the model declined steadily for times 2 and 3, and plummeted to near 0 towards females. Barash reasoned that this made evolutionary sense, since males would be more sensitive to intruders before eggs were laid than afterwards, when they had some confidence that their genes are inside. Having devised this plausible story, he considered his work as completed. I mean, there could be a lot of different reasons why that's the case. I wonder what his hypothesis is. The results are consistent with the explanation of evolutionary theory. Thus, aggression towards an intruding male, the model, would clearly be especially advantageous early in the breeding season, when territories and nests are normally defended. The initial aggressive response to the mated female is also adapted to that, given a situation suggesting a high probability of adultery, i.e. the presence of a model near the female. And assuming that replacement females are available, obtaining a new mate would enhance the fitness of males. The decline in male-female aggressiveness during incubation and fledgling states would be attributed to the impossibility of being cuckolded after the eggs had been laid. The results are consistent with the evolutionary interpretation. I can understand why you had that hypothesis. I mean, why would you expend energy otherwise, right? That's one of the big problems with things in general. Defending yourself costs energy. They are indeed consistent, but what about the obvious alternative, dismissed without test by Barash? Male returns at times 2 and 3, approaches the model, tests it a bit, recognizes it as the same phony he saw before, and doesn't bother his female. Why not at least perform the obvious test for his alternative to a conventional adaptive story? Expose a male to the model for the first time after the eggs are laid. That's true. That's a good point. Since we criticized Barash's work, Morton et al. 1978 repeated it with some variations, including the introduction of a female model in the closely related eastern bluebird. We hope to confirm, they wrote, that Barash's conclusions represent a widespread evolutionary reality, at least within the genus Cialia. Unfortunately, we were unable to do so. They find no anti-cuckoldry behavior at all. Males never approach their females aggressively after testing the model at any next stage. Instead, females often approaches the male model, and in any case, attack female models more than males attack the male models. This violent response resulted in the near destruction of the female model after presentations and its complete demise on the third, as a female flew off with the model's head early in the experiment to lose it for us in the brush. Yet, instead of calling Barash's selected theory into question, they merely devised one of its own to render more results in the adaptationalist mode. Perhaps, they conjecture, replacement males are scarce in their species and abundance in Barash's. Since Barash's males can replace a potentially unfaithful female, they can afford to be choosy and possessive. Eastern bluebird males are stuck with uncommon mates and had best be respectful. They conclude, if we did not support Barash's suggestion that the bluebirds show anticuckoldry adaptations, we suggest that both studies still had, quote, results that are consistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory, as we presume any careful study would. But what good study is a theory that cannot fail in careful study, since evolutionary theory, they clearly mean the action of the natural selection applied to particular cases, rather than the fact of transmutation itself. I mean, I think that this is a good example of just a poorly designed experiment with not a good control. The master's voice re-examined. Oh God, here's Darwin again. My point about Darwin was that, like, people always bring up, the anti-evolutionist viewpoints always bring up Darwin as this like big gotcha. They'll bring in like, what about this in his experiment? What about this in the experiment? And it's like we are so far beyond Darwin now, like in modern evolutionary theory, that it's like, it almost doesn't, like, modern biology doesn't really, isn't like, it has something to do with Darwin, right? Like in the idea of, speciation. But like, for example, we know there is not this adherence to, like, for example, speciation that he kind of saw. We do know that there are phenotypic variations that can happen because of RNA silencing and methylation of the DNA. And that actually is passed on from generation to generation. So it's not necessarily mutations that can arise. It's actually a lot of other molecular mechanisms that we know now. So like the idea that Darwin is this sacred cow that cannot be questioned or touched is very odd to me. Okay. Let's see what they have to say now. Okay, that's my opinion. Let's see what they have to say. Since Darwin has attained sainthood, I have not pre-read this. I did not. He kicked me out of his thing because I haven't read this. So I haven't read this. Since Darwin has attained sainthood, if not divinity, among evolutionary biologists, and since all since invoke God's allegiance, Darwin has often been depicted as a radical selectionist at heart who invoked other mechanisms only in retreat, and only as a result of his age's own lamented ignorance about the mechanisms of heredity. This view is false. Okay, let's read that again. Since Darwin has attained sainthood among evolutionary biologists, and since all sides invoke God's allegiance, Darwin has often been depicted as a radical selectionist at heart who invoked other mechanisms only in retreat, and only as a result in his age's own lamented ignorance about the mechanisms of heredity. I mean, they didn't know. He didn't know, right? He didn't know about DNA. He didn't know about nucleotides at that point. I think the idea is that how would he have known these molecular mechanisms existed? This view is false. Although Darwin regarded selection as the most important of evolutionary mechanisms, as do we. I mean, I would say that if it's not that, what it would be, would the genetic code be the most important one? Would the accumulation of mutations in the population be more important than selection? That's a good question. I think that you could look at dogs. Dogs is a really good example. I was trying to bring this up. Dogs is a really good example of the power of selection, because you can see how that, with the same population, dogs aren't accumulating mutations at any different rates now, right? But we can see that, wow, even 100 years, 120 years of human selection has drastically changed dog breeds in size, scope, shape, all that kind of stuff. So that is a really strong indicator of the power of selection, that just humans tuning it just a little bit really changes the results. So therefore, the changes that you could see over millions of years, billions of years, especially with the the generational time of prokaryotes and eukaryotes, single-celled microbes and stuff. It's pretty incredible. Okay. Anyway, I didn't think about that. I would probably have to say I was thinking about maybe the genetic code, but I think I've changed my mind to probably selection. Okay. No argument from opponents angered him more than the common attempt to caricature and trivialize his theory by stating that it relied exclusively on natural selection. In the last edition of The Origin, he wrote, as my conclusions have lately been misrepresented, and it has been stated that I attribute the modification of species exclusively to natural selection, I may be permitted to remark that in the first edition of this work and subsequently, I place in a most conspicuous position, namely at the close of the introduction, the following words. I am convinced that natural selection has been the main, but not the exclusive, means of modification. Now, that's true, right? Because evolution is a lot of different mutations and stuff. There's a lot going on. Natural selection is different than evolution. This has been no avail. Great is the power of steady misinterpretation. Romanes, whose once famous essay in 1900 on Darwin's pluralism versus the panselectionism of Wallace and Wiseman, deserves a resurrection, noted of the passage, quote, in the whole range of Darwin's writings, there cannot be found a passage so strongly worded as this. It presents the only note of bitterness in all the thousands of pages which he has published. Apparently, Romanes did not know the letter Darwin wrote to Nature in 1880, in which he castigated Sir Wyville Thomson for caricaturing his theory as panselectionist. Quote, I am sorry to find that Sir Wyville Thomson does not understand the principle of natural selection. If he had done so, he would not have written the following sentence in the introduction of the Voyage of the Challenger. Quote, the character of the abyssal fauna refuses to give the least support to the theory which refers the evolution of species to extreme variation guided only by natural selection. Interesting. This is a standard of criticism not commonly reached by theologians and metaphysicians when they write on scientific subjects, but it is something new as coming from a naturalist. Can Sir Wyville Thomson name one who had said that the evolution of species depends only on natural selection? As far as concerns himself, I believe that no one has brought forward so many observations on the effects of the use and disuse of the parts, as I have done in the variation of animals and plants under domestication. Oh, interesting. That's what he was talking about there. And then these observations were made for this special object. I have likewise there adduced a considerable body of facts showing the direct action of external conditions on organisms. Okay. We do not now regard all of Darwin's subsidiary mechanisms as significant or even valid, though many, including direct modification and correlation of growth, are very important. But we should cherish his consistent attitude of pluralism in attempting to explain nature's complexity. Okay. It's hard to understand. It's just hard to, in my mind, I'm thinking pluralism, I'm thinking genomes, I'm thinking all that kind of stuff. I just can't abstractly take that out of it. So it's interesting to hear his take. Okay, 5. Dude, we are gonna read this whole thing. Oh my God. This is the last section though. A partial typology of alternatives to the adaptation program. Okay, so this is where they're making their argument finally, hopefully. They've kind of gone over everyone else's, so hopefully they're going to start making their own argument. In Darwin's pluralistic spirit, we present an incomplete hierarchy of alternatives to immediate adaptation for the explanation of form, function, and behavior. This is so crazy. an incomplete hierarchy of alternatives. No adaptation and no selection at all. At present, population geneticists are sharply divided on the question of how much genetic polymorphism. Okay, they're going to give their own hypotheses for a lot of this stuff. No adaptation and no selection on the part of the issue. Form is the part of the correlated to the other under the important referring to mysterious laws. Just kind of reading through this. I want to go through modern ideas, not just like this is their modern discussion. I want to like actually go through myself the decoupling of selection and adaptation, selection without adaptation. So they're kind of like reviewing this idea, another unfairly maligned approach to evolution. Okay. Oh, they mentioned algae. Huge. Let's read this section. Another and unfairly maligned approach to evolution. In continental Europe, evolutionists have never much attracted to the Anglo-American penchant for atomizing organisms into parts and trying to explain each as a direct adaptation. That's so crazy. That's exactly what I was saying. But he said, I don't get what he was talking about here. Because he kept saying that this shiny beak is a different example that can't be explained, and it can. Their general alternatives exist in both a strong and a weak form. In the strong form, as advocated by such theorists as Scheidenwolf and Romain and Grass, natural selection under the adaptationist program can explain superficial modifications as the Boo plan that fit structure to environment. Why moles are blind. Oh my God, I was talking about geckos here. It's so nuts. But giraffes have long necks. The ducks have webbed feet, for example. The important steps of evolution, the construction of the bow plane itself, and the transition between blow plane must involve other unknown and perhaps internal mechanisms. So this is the phenotypic elasticity that they didn't understand. That's what I was talking about. We believe that the English biologists have been right in rejecting the strong form as close to the appeal to mysticism. But the argument has a weaker and paradoxically powerful form that has not been appreciated, but deserves to be. It is also acknowledged conventional selection for superficial modifications of the bow plan. I don't understand what the bow plan is. Is that just this guy? Is he blow plane? I don't understand what that is. And also, but the argument has a weaker and paradoxically powerful form that has not been appreciated, but deserves to be. It acknowledges a conventional selection for superficial modifications of the bow plan. I don't know what the bow plan is. Is it like the idea for what an organism is? It holds instead that the basic body plans of organisms are so integrated and so replete with constraints upon adaptation, categories 2 of 5 of the typology, that conventional styles of selective arguments can explain little of interest about them. It does not deny that the change, when it occurs, may be mediated by natural selection, but it holds that constraints restrict possible paths and modes of change so strongly that the constraints themselves become much of the most interesting aspects of evolution. Okay. Agreed. You can't just throw this stuff away. We have to actually study this stuff, which is what I was trying to say. Rupert Riedel, the Austrian zoologist, has tried to develop this thesis for English audiences in 1977 and it now been translated. It writes, quote, "The living world happens to be crowded by universal patterns of organizations with most obviously find no direct explanation through environmental conditions or adaptive radiation, but exist primarily through universal requirements which can be expected under the system's condition of complex organization itself. This is not self-evident, for the whole of the huge and profound thought collected in the field of morphology from Goethe to Romain has virtually been cut off from modern biology. It is not taught in the most American universities. Even the teachers who could teach it have disappeared." Dude, that's insane that he read this and that he silenced me for trying to put the argument that they're saying that people that biologists are having. I was giving an argument that aligned to the view of this paper, but he didn't. I just hadn't read it. I rejected it because I don't care what. It doesn't matter if they say they agree with me or not. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. Constraints upon evolutionary change may be ordered into at least two categories. All evolutionists are familiar with phyletic constraints as embodied in Gregory's classic distinction, 1936, between habitats and heritage. Habitus and heritage. We acknowledge a kind of phyletic inertia in recognizing, for example, that humans are not optimally designed for upright posture because of such of our bow plan evolved for quadrupedal life. We also invoke phyletic constraint in explaining why no mollusks fly in air and no insects are as large as elephants. Interesting. Oh, okay. I see what they're saying about phyletic constraints now. Developmental constraints as subcategory of phyletic restrictions may hold that the most powerful reign of all over possible evolutionary pathways in complex organisms, early stages of autonology, are remarkably refractory to evolutionary change, presumably because the differentiation of organ systems and their integration into a functioning body is such a delicate process, so easily derailed by early errors with the accumulating effects. Yeah, it's crazy that there's relics of our evolutionary past in our genomes that we can't really, like looking at humans embryology, for example, like looking at us, we have like this crazy, like looking like a tail, all this kind of stuff. You can kind of see the evolutionary past. Van Beer's fundamental embryological laws represent little more than a recognition that early stages are both highly conservative and strongly restrictive of later development. Haeckel's biogenetic law, the primary subject of late 19th evolutionary biology, rested upon a misreading of the same data. Yeah, because we're not starting off with a clean plate. Like evolution and mutations don't happen like a clean slate every time. They're holistic, and genomes work together. You just can't have. Yeah. If development occurs in integrated packages and cannot be pulled apart piece by piece in evolution, then the adaptationist program cannot explain the alteration of developmental programs underlying all changes of bow plan. The German paleontologist Schaefer, who work deserves far more attention than it has received, has emphasized what he calls the Bausteine, or architectural constraints. These arise not from the formal adaptations restrained in the new ecological setting of phyletic constraints as usually understood, but as architectural restrictions that never were adaptations, but rather necessary consequences of material and design selected to build the basic bow plane. We devoted the first section of this paper to non-biological examples of this category. Spaniards must exist as a blueprint specifies that the dome shall rest on the grounded arches, and the architectural constraints can exert a far-ranging influence upon organisms as well. Yeah, we're constrained the fact that we're mammals, for example. And a fascinating example, Seelhaker has shown that the divaricate form of architecture, divaricate? I don't know what that word is. Occurs again and again in all forms of mollusks and brachiopods as well. The basic form expresses itself in a variety of structures: raised ornamental lines, patterns of coloration, internal structures in the mineralization of calcite, and incised grooves. He does not know what generates this pattern and feels that the traditional and nearly exclusive focus on the adaptation value of such manifestation has diverted attention from questions of its genesis to its growth, and also prevented its recognition as a general phenomenon. It must arise from other characteristic patterns of inhomogeneity in the growing mantle, probably from the generation of interference patterns around regularly spaced centers. The general pattern may not be directed adaptation at all. Oh my God. Okay, we're almost done. Schaefer then argues that the most manifestations of the pattern are probably non-adaptive. His reasons vary, but seem generally sound to us. Some are based on field observations, color patterns that remain invisible because clams possessing them either would live buried in the sediments or remain covered with a perostrum so thick that its colors cannot be seen. Exactly. They have benefits that are not given to they're seen as their first function. Others rely on more general principles, presence only in odd and pathogenic individuals, rarity and developmental anomaly, excessive variability compared to much reduced variability with the same general structure, assumes a form judged functional on engineering grounds. In a distinct minority of cases, the divaricate pattern becomes functional in each of these four categories. Figure 3. Divaricate ribs may act as scoops and other. This is exactly what I was saying. That you might have parts of these pieces of DNA that we don't think are useful, but they are. So the idea that these traits that they're just lost, it just doesn't exist. You create mutations in them, and in order to not make that protein anymore, so the allele frequency, for example, might go down, but the genes are still there. The pseudo gene, for example, for vitamin C for humans are still there. That's a good example. The color chevrons are mimetic in one species that lives in hydroxene branches. Here, the variability is strongly reduced. The mineralization chevrons are probably adaptive in only one remarkable creature, the peculiar bivalve. In other species, they either appear in odd specimens. This clam is uniquely flattened in a anterior-posterior direction. It lies in the substrate, posterior up. Distributed over its rear end are the triangles of mineralization. They are translucent, while the rest of the shell is opaque. Under these windows dwell endosymbiotic algae. So there is a function that they didn't see at first, but there's a function that happens. All previous literature on divaricate structures has focused on its adaptive significance and failed to find any of the most cases. But Seelker is probably right in representing this case as the spandrels sealing holes in sacrifice bodies of the first section. The divaricate pattern is a fundamental architectural constraint. Occasionally, since it is there, it is useful to beneficial effect, but we cannot understand the pattern or its evolutionary meaning by viewing these infrequent and secondary adaptations as reasons for patterns itself. Galton constrained the adaptationist program with a focus on constraints and modes of development by citing a telling anecdote about Herbert Spencer's fingerprints. Okay, I'm not going to read his fingerprints. This is the ending. Here we go. We feel that the potential rewards of abandoning exclusive focus on the adaptationer program are very great indeed. Exactly, this exclusive focus. Exactly, this exclusive focus on just the beak thing, the beak covering of this hitchhiking gene. We do not offer a counsel of despair, as adaptationists have charged. For non-adaptive does not mean non-intelligible. We welcome the richness that a pluralistic approach so akin to Darwin's spirits can provide. Under the adaptationist program, the great historic themes of developmental morphology and bowel plan were very largely abandoned. For if selection can break any correlation and optimize parts separately, then an organism's integration counts for little. Exactly. If you can just break it off and just say, yeah. Too often, the adaptationist program gave us evolutionary biology of parts and genes, but not of organisms. I would argue genomes there. They're talking about the holistic of the entire organism, the genomes. It is assumed that all transitions should occur step by step. It assumed that all transitions could occur step by step and underrated the importance of the integrated developmental blocks and pervasive constraints of history and architecture. That's those abandoned genes, those hitchhiking genes that don't have any purpose, but they're the building blocks that things can go forward with. A pluralistic view could put organisms with all their recalcitrant yet intelligible complexity back into evolutionary theory. Okay. I don't understand why he thought that I would disagree with that. So I'm curious about what is he thinking about? Can we think of what's modern theory thinking about? I think that he's wrong with his telling of it. But maybe another biologist would be better at explaining it. Maybe I'm not understanding. Okay. Also, hitchhiking genetic draft or hitchhiking effect is when allele changes frequency not because of itself is under natural selection, but because it is near another gene that is undergoing selective sweep and that is on the same DNA chain. So his whole point is completely wrong. His understanding of what a hitchhiking gene is completely wrong. That's what I was thinking. Like, there are genes, but he wouldn't want to talk about DNA. There are genes that can have, like, you have a histone nearby or something like that. You can have parts of the genome that is not regularly accessible, that can be hard to genetically modify, or transcription can be hard to happen. Or in this case, an ability for a nearby promoter maybe to recruit a bunch of polymerases to it, and then that would cause a gene to be overexpressed when it normally wouldn't be. Or in this case, the opposite, right? If it's a portion of the genome is methylated and you're right by that, the methylation is going to impact you too, right? Because you're not going to be able to have your part of the your genome being expressed. So, oh my god, that's so funny, because his idea, genetic hitchhiking, is when an allele changes frequency not because it itself is under natural selection. He's saying that it would be, but because it is near another gene that is undergoing the selective sweep. Oh my gosh, that is so funny. It's a beneficial mutation that increases the frequency and becomes fixed in the population, and leads to the reduction of the elimination of genetic variation among the nucleotides near the mutation. Oh my God. So, hey Titan, you can watch the VOD, man. You can. So this has everything to do with the DNA. He was only thinking about it as a trait that is undergoing selection or not going under selection, right? That was his idea, that the shininess of the beak versus the largeness of the beak, one is selected for and one is not. My argument was that they're both being selected for. This paper agrees with me. This paper agrees with me. So and this is the example that he gave, but this agreed with me. And even his understanding of genetic hitchhiking is wrong. So it has everything to do with the DNA and the nearby selection. Oh my gosh, this is crazy, because his whole argument was that basically something wasn't selected for, causing that trait to be taken forward in the population or not. And this is exactly the wrong. Yeah, I mean, I tried to rationalize with the man, but he wouldn't. He already told me he was mean to you. I mean, look, man, it's okay. I mean, I don't harbor any ill will against him. I think that his like I said before, like, I think that his science teachers failed him, and it's on us. Like, this science channel exists to try to prevent that from happening in the future, so that people can kind of understand what's happening at the highest level and what's happening with it. So no wonder he's thinking like, I'm an idiot for not thinking about genetic hitchhiking, but his understanding of an explanation of genetic hitchhiking is fundamentally wrong. So when one gene goes through a selective sweep, any other nearby polymorphisms that are linked in disequilibrium will tend to change their allele frequencies too. Selective sweeps happen when newly appeared and hence still rare mutations are advantageous and increasing in frequency. So his thing was that exactly, oh my God, this is crazy. So he's thinking the shiny beak has no advantage in natural selection, and so why would it be selected? And this is saying that in order for a hitchhiking gene has to happen, there has to be an advantageous mutation nearby in order for it to work. He didn't want to think about DNA and all that kind of stuff, but that is the basis for all of this happening. Neutral or even slightly deleterious alleles that happen to be close by on the chromosome hitchhike along with the sweep. In contrast, effects on a neutral locus due to linkage disequilibrium with newly appeared deleterious mutations are called background selection. Both genetic hitchhiking and background selection are stochastic evolutionary forces, like genetic drift. Okay, oh my God. So his examples that he was trying to get and that he was trying to give didn't have genetic drift. They didn't have any type of mutation. They didn't have any. That was the only way that he could actually explain this thing. And that was why it didn't make any sense to me. Didn't understand what he was talking about. I mean, because he's failing to understand what he was even saying. Oh my God. So the paper that he read, he misunderstood. The explanation that he has of genetic hitchhiking is completely wrong. My understanding of genetic hitchhiking isn't the best, I guess, because I'm thinking of it in the fact of traits that are being selected for. This isn't. I should have just looked up the Wikipedia of what genetic hitchhiking is. I mean, but I should have done that. Oh, that's frustrating. Okay, outcomes. Well, I just read the entire paper that he linked that he called me an idiot for not having read. And I hate to say it, but I think it agrees with me. Yeah, I mean, I don't get it. I don't understand it. Okay. I think my view agrees with current evolutionary theory. It's just that his understanding and explaining his reasoning was anathema to my current understanding, and that's why we had the problem. Okay, hitchhiking occurs when a polymorphism is in linked disequilibrium with a second locus that is undergoing a selective sweep. Again, a selective sweep in genetics, a selective sweep is the process which a new beneficial mutation that increases its frequency and becomes fixed in the population leads to the reduction or elimination of genetic variation among nucleotide sequences that are near the mutation. That's really interesting. So it's the process of which a new beneficial mutation, so a beneficial mutation, something that's so good that is being selected for so strongly, increases its frequency and becomes fixed in the population. So it's everywhere now. So think antibiotics or something like that, which you have to have in order to survive in an environment. Leads to reduction or elimination of genetic variation among nucleotide sequences that are near the mutation. So you're talking about like genetic recombination events. You're talking about DNA repair mechanisms. I guess, man, I wonder if this could happen in bacteria. I can understand this because they're sharing environmental DNA back and forth. But it would be really interesting to actually see this happening in humans or higher evolved eukaryotes. Just because we don't take up environmental DNA through horizontal gene transfer, but I can see how this happens in microbes constantly. I doubt he wants to talk to me further, man. He kicked me out. So, yeah, he kicked me out of the voice chat because he thought that I didn't agree with biologists and that I was an idiot. So I don't think that he wants to talk to me again. Let's see here. That's fine. It doesn't matter to me. I know. I do this trying to talk about. He didn't want to talk about the science and stuff, so it's kind of frustrating to me. Okay. Hitchhiking occurs when a polymorph. That's really interesting. So basically, Interesting. Okay, so hitchhiking occurs when a polymorph is in a linkage I'm not a geneticist, so this is really interesting to go through this and learn about this stuff. The actual population genetics of it, not his understanding of it. This I can understand. This makes more sense. What he was saying, no, that doesn't make it's all about a molecular mechanism of the mutation rate of a nearby loci, a locus. It has nothing to do with his natural selection part. It's actually the opposite of that. Not because itself is under natural selection. That's why I was like, it didn't make any sense. If it's under natural selection, it's being selected for. But anyway, moving on. Hitchhiking occurs when a polymorphism is a linkage disequilibrium with the second locus that is undergoing a selective sweep. The allele that is linked to that adaptation will increase in frequency, in some cases until it becomes fixed in the population. Okay. The allele that is linked to the adaptation will increase the frequency. The other allele, which is linked to the non-advantageous version, will decrease in frequency, in some cases until extinction. Overall, hitchhiking reduces the amount of genetic variation. Oh, that makes sense. A hitchhiker mutation or a passenger mutation in biology may be itself be neutral, advantageous, or deleterious. Oh, that's interesting. Recombination can interrupt the process of genetic hitchhiking, like I was talking about, ending it before the hitchhiking neutral or deleterious allele becomes fixed or goes extinct. The closer a hitchhiking polymorphism is to the gene under selection, the less opportunity there is for recombination to occur. Interesting. The less opportunity there is. Because you'd think that like a double-stranded break would just more easily get them if they're had that problem. This leads to a reduction in genetic variation near a selective sweep that is closer to the selective site. This pattern is useful for using population data to detect selective sweeps and hence to detect which genes may have been under very recent selection. Interesting. So he's thinking so. Interesting. That's interesting that the other allele, which is linked to me, the allele that is linked to the adaptation will increase in a frequency, which we understand it's linked in some cases until it becomes fixed, which is interesting because it's not under selection. So that is interesting that it actually becomes that high. The other allele, which is linked to the non-advantageous version, will decrease in frequency. We understand that. Overall, hitchhiking reduces the amount of genetic variation because why would you have... It's interesting. I wonder if it's the same amino acid or if we're actually talking the exact same nucleotide sequence. It seems like we're talking about the exact one. A hitchhiking mutation may itself be neutral, advantageous, or deleterious. That's interesting. Recombination. Oh, we already did that. Okay, cool. So through population genetics, you can basically see the removal of genetic variation in a population for a specific gene and look at other nearby genes and mutations that would be hitchhiking towards that one that's being selected for. That makes sense. Yes, because the entire genome is being selected for, right? Oh my God. Both genetic drift and genetic draft are random evolutionary processes, i.e. they stochastically and in a way that is not correlated with selection in the gene in question. Drift is the change in the frequency of an allele in a population due to random sampling in each generation. Okay, true. Yes, I agree. Draft is the change in the frequency of an allele due to the randomness of what other non-neutral alleles it happens to be found in association with. Assuming genetic drift is the only evolutionary force acting on an allele, after one generation in many replicated idealized population size of n, each starting with allele frequencies P and Q, the newly added variance in allele frequency across the population, i.e. the degree of randomness of the outcome, is PQ divided by 2n. This equation shows that the effect of genetic drift is heavily dependent on population size, defined as the actual number of individuals in an idealized population. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, because that's what I was trying to talk about too. He was saying no genetic drift or no mutations. I'm thinking, how does that work? Of course there's going to be things, but okay. That's interesting. The newly variant, interesting. Okay. Genetic draft results in similar behavior in the equation above, but with the effective population size that may have no relationship to the actual number of individuals in the population. Oh, weird. Instead, the effective population size may be dependent on factors such as the recombination rate and the frequency and strength of the beneficial mutations. Instead, the effective population size may depend on factors such as the recombination rate. Genetic draft results in similar behavior to the equation, but with effective population that may have no relationship to the actual. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. So it's not this like. It's not the Finch's example is like the worst one. The increase in variance between replicate populations due to drift. Instead, the effective population size may depend on factors such as the recombination rate and the frequencies and strength of the beneficial mutations. Interesting. So recombination rate is going to change up the genome too much, right? So if we have pieces of DNA getting inserted or things being shuffled around, and like that happens all the time in a bacteria, for example, that's going to not allow this stuff to happen. But the frequency and strength of the beneficial mutations has a big impact. Interesting. So in his example, I think he was talking about that's what he was trying to say with the beneficial mutations. So if but in the frequency and strength of the beneficial mutations, I think that he was thinking about the big beak being, it would have to be necessary in order to. I'm trying to think back of our conversation. He was trying to say that the large beak was necessary so that it would bring a shininess of the beak. So if the beneficial mutation is large, then the shininess of the thing, if it's by in the genome, but she didn't talk about or recognize, then I guess that he actually had a point there then. Interesting. The increase in variance between replicate populations due to drift is independent, whereas draft is autocorrelated, i.e., if an allele frequency goes up because of genetic drift, that contains no information about the next generation, whereas if it goes up because of genetic draft, it is more likely to go up than down in the next generation. Oh, interesting. So it's kind of like a runaway train thing. Genetic draft generates a different allele spectrum to genetic drift. Applications. The Y chromosome, interesting, does not undergo recombination, making it particularly prone to the fixations of deleterious mutations via hitchhiking. This has been proposed as an explanation as to why there are so few functional genes on the Y chromosome. Interesting. I don't understand. So there, I mean, so there is, I mean, there is a an evolutionary reason for this to happen. That's what I don't understand. It's because he's not thinking about he's not thinking about it in the terms of genes and genomes and that kind of stuff. He's thinking about it in the terms of a trait. So the reason for this to exist and the reason why it has been evolved and selected for is because it gives such a beneficial mutation in the population. And it becomes a runaway train kind of thing. That makes sense. Hitchhiking is necessary for the evolution of higher mutation rates to be favored. Wow, hitchhiking is necessary for the evolution of higher mutation rates to be favored by natural selection of evolvability. A hypothetical mutator M increases the general mutation rate in the area around it. Due to the increased mutation rate, the nearby A allele may be mutated into a new advantageous allele. Ah, that's cool. So it could actually generate more variation by being created by a hitchhiking allele that has gone to fixation, but that gene is like a polymerase with a crazy high mutation rate. Ah, that's interesting. That is cool. That is really cool. Well, he's not thinking about that, but that is amazing. That is really cool. So there's a huge reason. The individual, so that is really cool. So, just the ability to have higher mutation rates is going to be a huge thing and beneficial. Not always, right? Not always. You don't want always your instruction manual to have a bunch of changes to it, but you can have in particular reasons. Like, let's say you're in a region, in an environment that needs a lot of phenotypic elasticity. You need to change your phenotype a lot. You have changing environments, you have changing predation, all that kind of stuff. You want to be able to move around a lot. So you're going to have a large genome. And then on top of that, you might have something like this, right? Where you actually might have a mutator polymerase that has a mutation rate that's higher that can be turned on in order to do stuff like this. So that makes sense. A hypothetical mutator M increases the general mutation rate in the area around it. Due to the increased mutation rate, the nearby A allele will be mutated in a new advantageous allele. Oh, that is very cool. So he's fundamentally misunderstanding that the hitchhiking gene doesn't necessarily go down, and that's that it doesn't. It could actually go to fixation itself. That's really cool. Yeah, Titan. I don't know. We had some of them in here. They were being nice. They seemed fine. I don't have anything against them. Okay, the individual in which the chromosome lies will now have a selective advantage over other individuals of the species. So the allele A star, the mutation, will spread throughout the population by the normal process of natural selection. M, due to its proximity to A, will be dragged through into the general population. This process only works when M is very close to the allele it is mutated. A greater distance would increase the chance of recombination, separating M from A, leaving M alone with the deleterious mutations it may have caused. For this reason, evolution of mutators is generally expected to happen largely in asexual species where recombination cannot disrupt linkage disequilibrium. That's really cool. I wish I just read this Wikipedia. I didn't know we were going to talk about hitchhiking genes so much when we had talked about that. I was trying to look up his paper because I thought he was referencing that, but he obviously wasn't because he hadn't read that paper, or he read it and misunderstood it because it agrees with what I was saying. So I was a little confused. The natural theory of molecular evolution assumes that new mutations are either deleterious and quickly purged by selection or else neutral, with very few being adaptive. It also assumes that the behavior of the neutral allele frequencies can be restricted by the mathematics of genetic drift. Genetic hitchhiking has therefore been viewed as a major challenge to neutral theory and an explanation for why genome-wide versions of the McConnell-Crichton test appear to indicate a high proportion of mutations become fixed for reasons connected to selection. That's so interesting. Neutral theory of molecular evolution. What? What? The neutral theory of molecular evolution holds that the most evolutionary changes occur at the molecular level, and most of the variation within and between species are due to random genetic drift of the mutant alleles that are selectively neutral. That's a really good theory. Oh no. That's a really good idea. Interesting. Dude, I gotta read this. That's really cool. I wish I just had read this. I was trying to... I didn't understand what he was trying to say. I'm frustrated with myself that I didn't. I'm trying to, like, be present in the conversation, and not just like do all this research in real time, but I need to get better at, like, because I'm trying to understand what they're thinking, and he's asking me questions, so I don't really have time to, like, do a bunch of the research in real time, but I need to do better at looking up fundamental misunderstandings like that in real time and not going through this. Because now I wanted to talk about that paper, and I linked it to him, and I wanted to talk about it, but he didn't want to talk about it. And because I even told him, I was like, this actually agrees with me, man. I don't understand what you're talking about. Man, I wish I just read the genetic hitchhiking thing. That's interesting. This is so interesting. But because it is near another gene that is undergoing a selective sweep and that is on the same DNA chain. But he did not. I feel like in a discussion, it's up to you to articulate your point, especially if you're going to be coming at the biggest and most central theory of biology. You should be able to articulate some of these points. And he had a fundamental misunderstanding of what genetic hitchhiking is. So I don't really know what to say on that one. That's kind of like, that's the theory that he is using to set his hat on to take out the entire theory of evolution and natural selection. And he failed to do that, so I don't know what to tell him. Okay. Well, that was a big oof. I don't know. Anyway. All right. I am out of here. I don't know what's going to happen with this VOD, but we'll see. It wasn't really a high level discussion, and he didn't really articulate any points that made any sense. So I don't know if I'm going to keep the VOD up. We'll have to see. How exciting. I don't want to delete any conversations, but I don't, his contention is that Darwin would not have known about DNA, so you have to show how Darwin got to natural selection. I mean, Darwin's central theory is about natural selection. It's all about natural selection. That's what we just read. This whole thing talks about how it's like, it's all about Darwin's idea of, I really wonder if he's read this. I don't understand. This is the thing that I hadn't read before, and he was like, oh my God, how can you have not read these S.J. Goulds and Leotonin? And I'm like, I don't know, dude. Oh my God. R.C. Leotonin. I don't like doing this, like, but you know what I mean? I'm like, because I don't want to, like, character assassinate people, but I'm like, who are you talking about, bro? Like, you know what I mean? Like, for real. Stephen Jay Gould, American paleontologist, evolutionary historian of science. He's one of the most influential and widely read authors of popular science of his generation. Dude, that's how that paper read. I was like, is this like a pop sci like thing? He doesn't realize Darwin wasn't looking at shiny beak, and that was a footnote. Big beak was all that was needed for Darwin to infer natural selection. I don't know. I don't know what he was. He kept talking about that. He doesn't. I don't think he understands what he was talking about there. Like I don't even think he understands his own point. Honestly, when he was explaining it in the other stream and now this, it was so jumbled with jargon that I don't know if he really understood. I don't think that he understood. Yeah. Punctuated equilibrium. A theory that proposes that once a species appears in the fossil record, the population will become stable. Huh. Wow. I don't know about that one. That's a little weird. The theory proposes that most evolution is characterized by long periods of evolutionary stability, infrequently punctuated by periods of branching speciation. Is that right? The theory was contrasted by phyletic gradualism, the popular idea that evolutionary change is marked by a pattern of smooth and continuous change. I would say this is more. I would understand that as more because the source of the variation would be variability and mutation rates, but then you would have natural selection. You'd have stable rates of natural selection. I think that's what this guy's argument would be, that you have long periods of things being okay. So why would things drastically be changing? Yeah, I would say that too, Titan. Okay, well, let's see if this is the spandrels. Let's see if spandrels is on here. Oh my god, it's a whole section. Oh shoot. With Richard Leotonin. It's so funny that he thought that this is okay. That's fine. With Richard Leotonin, Gould wrote an influential 1979 paper entitled "The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm," which introduced the architectural term spandrel into evolutionary biology. What the hell, man? Yeah, that is true. If that probably wouldn't be been in there. Spandrel is a triangular space which exists over the haunches of an arc. Spandrel, more often called pendritives in this context, are found particularly and classically. Okay, when visiting Venice, Gould noted the spandrels of the San Marco Cathedral, while quite beautiful, were not spaces planned by the architect. Rather than spaces arise the necessary architectural byproducts of mounting a dome on rounded arches. Gould and Leotonin thus defined spandrels in the evolutionary biology context to mean any biological feature of an organism that arises as a necessary consequence of other features, which is not directly selected for by natural selection. Proposed examples include the muscularized genitalia in female, masculinized genitalia of female hyenas, exapted in the umbusculus of the brooding chamber by snails, and shoulder hump of the giant Irish deer. Yeah, I mean, that's so funny because, I mean, this is, as we had just read, I mean, biological features in an organism that arises as a necessary side consequence of other features but not directly selected for by the selection. Hey, what's up, dude? Yeah, I read the whole paper. I had read the whole paper. Okay. In Voltaire's Candide, Dr. Pangloss is portrayed as a skinless, clueless scholar who, despite the evidence, insists that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Gould and Lewitonin asserted that Panglossian for evolutionary biologists is view all traits as atomized things that can be naturally selected for, and criticize biologists for not granting theoretical space for other causes such as phyletic and developmental constraints. Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah, but I mean, that's okay, yeah, but I mean, this isn't. I mean, one, this isn't like the end all be all biology paper for everything, right? This is, but I would still say that in general, the paper actually agrees with me. The pluralistic approach to identifying the agents of evolutionary change, pluralistic, Okay. Yeah. An adaptionist program has adapted evolutionary thought in England and the United States during the past 40 years. It is based on the faith in the power of natural selection as an optimizing agent. It proceeds by breaking an organism into unitary traits and proposing an adaptive story for each considered separately. So I would say that it's not, right? That there are holistic, it has to be taken all together. Trade-offs among competing selective demands exert the only brake upon perfection. We criticize this approach and attempt to reassert a competing notion that organisms must be analyzed as integrated wholes with bowplane, so constrained by phyletic heritage, pathways of development, and general architecture that the constraints themselves become more interesting and more important in delimiting pathways of change than the selective force that may mediate change when it occurs. I mean, so, okay. I want to get past like this paper. Okay. The actual definition for genetic hitchhiking is completely different than how you were portraying it. Okay. I genuinely don't care about this paper. I don't care about it. It's something that you don't understand here is that these are my colleagues. Okay. I don't worship at the shrine of these people, and it really doesn't impact me. These are my colleagues, and I can critique their work for whatever it is. And I don't even think that it is that modern definitions of genetic hitchhiking agree with this. But I would say that in theory, reading the paper, I would say it agrees with me more than it doesn't. But that's aside, doesn't matter. Genetic hitchhiking is also called genetic drift or the hitchhiking effect, in which an allele changes frequency, not because it is self under natural selection, but because, this is the key point, but because it is near another gene that is undergoing a selective sweep and that is on that same DNA change. Okay, that's fine. So the idea is that these things aren't just aberrant traits that are being like selected for, whether or not it's beak or selected or shininess of the beak. It's actual parts of the DNA, right? And these are near each other. So it has a huge part, like the locality of these genes in proportion to one another is integral to the existence of genetic hitchhiking. No, you're not talking about that. No, you were saying you were disparaging me for even bringing up DNA and genomes and all that kind of stuff. So it's just false. And this is a good example. So even your application, even if this was you were right, there are so many different applications that make complete sense with genetic hitchhiking, and it is not this linchpin to take the entire theory of evolution and natural selection completely apart. I mean, it's just not. So there are tons of different ways that that genetic hitchhiking could actually lead to higher mutation rates, and that would be good, right? Because there could lead to, the DNA points don't matter. Exactly, and you're completely wrong, man. It's because it is near, that the whole point why this actually is impacted is because it is near another gene that is undergoing a selective sweep, and that's on the same DNA chain. So you're fundamentally misunderstanding like what's happening. So like, for example, okay, this is a mutator evolution. This is a really good example, and this is what I was talking about, and the idea that mutations and polymerase errors that are going to be causing, and it's good to have these pieces, this variability in the genome. Hitchhiking is necessary for the evolution of higher mutation rates to be favored by natural selection on evolvability, because there's not necessarily, so you want mutations, you want genetic diversity in your population, but you could have a rogue, you don't want to have too many changes, right? Too many errors constantly. So you can have nearby promoters, or, I mean, I don't want to use jargon here, but basically sigma factors that create promoters and transcription to happen selectively, but in the layman's terms, there are parts of genes that can be turned on specifically due to higher different reasons for the environment or anything like that. And that's what these pieces of like junk DNA, or as we used to call them, or genome size. So that's why genome size is so important. So a hypothetical mutator M, okay, so mutator M, the hypothetical mutator, this would be a polymerase that has a lot of, that's error prone, okay? A hypothetical mutator M increases the general mutation rate in the area around it, right? So you're gonna have something that is translated and it's created, and that this piece of, this is, for a whole host of reasons, is gonna increase the mutation rates. Due to the increased mutation rates, therefore, the nearby A allele, okay, so here the A star, may be mutated into a new advantageous allele, A star. So this is a reason why you could have, you want variation, right? You want new, let's say that you're an organism that's living in an environment that's changing constantly, or you have a lot of different predators or something like that. You want to be able to have that flip of the switch that you could switch on that would have higher mutation rates. Okay, so this is an example of the genetic hitchhiking, where A and M are hitchhiked together, and M is going to increase the amount of fitness that you have. Okay, so the individual in which this chromosome lies will now have a selective advantage over the individuals of the species. So the A star, the A mutated star, will spread through the population by the process of natural selection. M, due to the proximity to A, will be dragged through the general population. So M is the hitchhiking gene. M is going to have an allele frequency going to fixed, right? But it's conferring an advantage. So it is being selected for. This process only works when M is very close to the allele as it is mutated, because if this is very far, there could be double-stranded breaks that happen between M and A that would allow it to basically be sectioned off and to be changed. A greater distance would increase the rate of recombination, separating M and A star, leaving M alone with any deleterious mutations that it may have caused. Okay? So for this reason, evolution of mutators is generally expected to happen largely in asexual species where recombination cannot disrupt linkage disequilibrium. Okay, yeah. So if the same mutation that leads to big beaks, which is good, and the shiny beaks are just in effect big beak gene on a keratin sheath gene, then both are passed together. Yeah, I mean, or you could have that keratin gene that is given to the beak, creating that shininess, being used for the creation of shininess or the waterproofing their coat, for example, which would lead to higher installation rates and that kind of stuff. The one, yeah, exactly. Natural selection remains the mechanism by both getting fixed in the population. Exactly. This mutator evolution is a great example of this, right? Because you're creating diversity in the genome, and you are, and they're being hitchhiked at the same time. But M isn't being selected for exactly, right? You're not having like a, you have to have this mutator there in order to survive kind of thing. But it's being selected for by you're giving an advantageous condition. And this is why genome size is important. This is why phenotypic elasticity is important. So yeah, anyway, dude, I mean, this is what it is. I mean, you should look at some of these papers, and read some of this. Genetic draft is kind of like the idea that you were trying to talk about. So I think that, yeah, dude, good luck to you for trying to, no, I'm good, dude. Good luck to you on your own journey to, trying to learn about this stuff. And I look, there's good websites. Web of Science is a good one. I don't know if you need a, I don't know what to do. This is a good one. So if you wanted to learn about this stuff, I think probably genetic draft would be probably the way to look for it. I wonder what they said. Interesting. I wonder papers. In fact, you probably still don't know what's being said. Yeah, dude, I don't know everything about biology, and I'm not a geneticist. So yeah, I'm constantly learning. Yeah, that's not something that's bad. Yeah, of course. That's the whole point of being a scientist. And like it's awesome, like, but what you are articulating is not what this actually is. So I think that's the biggest thing. So, yeah, in a way that they are. Yeah. See, that's the thing. You're misunderstanding what they said. I read this entire thing, man. Like it is, you're atomizing it just to the beak, just to the shininess of the beak. And they're arguing against that. Yeah, okay, that's fine, dude. You're right. Then why would you want to talk to me if I don't even have good reading comprehension? So it's fine, dude. Like go talk to someone else. Like if you don't think that I don't have a good adequate understanding of biology, then that's fine. I mean, it's okay, dude. It's okay. I read through the entire thing and it was honestly pretty crazy. Yeah, I don't know. It is what it is, man. I read this thing for like hours, so I don't really want to go through it again. So okay, look at genetic hitchhiking, also called genetic draft, is when an allele changes frequency, not because it is self under natural selection, but because it is near another gene that is undergoing a selective sweep and that is on the same DNA chain. So that whole genome is being selected for. I'm talking about a pluralistic, encompassing thing. Okay. And that's what's happening. It's not an atomized trait by trait evolution that's happening. Okay. Well, I mean, that's how you explained it, man. That's how you explained it. So you weren't explaining it by this. The whole reason why this genetic hitchhiking exists and why it works is because of locality on the DNA chain, because it's near another gene that is going through a selective sweep. And you were right in a selective sweep is the process in which a new beneficial mutation that increases its frequency and becomes fixed in the population leads to reduced or elimination of genetic variation among nucleotide sequences that are near the mutation. And you can actually view that through population genetics, and you can see how the variation of that region would go down over time, which is an example and actually an experiment that you could run to try to prove your point of anything. But you don't deal with genes and DNA, so you wouldn't know that. But it's okay, dude. You're learning. It's okay. The whole point of like the point of the channel is to try to show the cool things that are happening in science that are going on, and hopefully like maybe you could read like a genetics paper or a population genetics paper that is kind of like studying this, and that would kind of like lead you down a path to better understanding what's actually happening. But I don't think that I can lead you down that. So but I good luck to you for learning. So anyway, I just hope for, it's okay, dude. It's all right. Who's Leah Tonin? I had heard the name. Leader in the developing of mathematical basis of population genetics. I wonder how Leah Tonin and Jay Gould would feel about you using their paper and as trying to disprove one of the fundamental theories of biology. I don't know. I don't know if they would have liked that. But hey. And I don't agree with everything on that paper, by the way, that they said, but that's fine. They're my peers and I can do that. You have dissenting views of science constantly. And I don't even think that modern geneticists would agree with this, but necessarily wholly. Like nobody, like in science, there's lots of disagreement constantly about things. So there isn't like this purity test. Okay. Dang, 1966 gel electrophoresis. That was probably like brand new. Published a paper that revolutionized population genetics. Surveyed dozens of loci in the fruit fly Drosophila and reported that a large fraction of the loci were polymorphic, and that the average locus there was about a 15% chance that the individual was heterozygous. Harry Harris reported similar results that he went at the same time. Previous work with gel electrophoresis had been reports of variation in single loci and did not have any sense of how common variation was. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, 1966, they're not understanding the genetic code, which is like fundamental idea. So this is the reason why you can have variation at those loci that he was not understanding at the point, but the idea being that each of these is a huge reason, in order to get alanine, for example, you could have GCU, GCC, GCA, GCG, and all of these, this diversity would be advantageous to the population in order to have it. So that's what he's finding there. That's really cool. Oh, here's the favor. Oh, there's another one. Criticizes the adaptionist school of thought that represents the prevalent evolutionary biology at the time using two metaphors. And they're right to try to think that not all traits are selected for it. Yeah, they wouldn't like it. Interesting. I wonder how they would think about you kicking me off for not agreeing with you then. Oh my gosh, you referred to it as an opinion piece, unlike most science, and it's not based on literature review or empirical data. I hate it for that reason, by the way. I'm trying to like always think about like authors said that Gould wrote the majority of the paper. It's too like, I'll be honest, it's too like pop sci for me. I don't really it's yeah, I mean I it's very you would never be able to get that published in papers nowadays about journals nowadays. It's pretty ridiculous. Interesting. Interesting. Spandrel's paper also criticizes adaptionists for not developing succinctly rigorous methods to test their hypotheses, which they, yeah, I mean, I feel like they should have like done something, any type of like experiment or something. That's just kind of, it is very, very odd. You'd have like maybe an op-ed. This would be maybe an op-ed in today. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the problem with this, the problem is that there's been with this paper and I mean, there's been a lot of this kind of like Darwinian fixation. There's been a lot of papers recently to kind of show that all changes can be passed on that aren't strictly mutations in the genome. So it can be, for example, like methylation of specific parts of the DNA. And that is going to cause a lot of downstream impacts, right? So methylation basically silences a portion of that genome to be transcribed and used in the future. So people have done that and shown that methylation can actually go through generations, so that you can have an impact in transcription and translation downstream without like the accumulation of premature stop codons or DNA polymerase errors in order to cause that kind of change. The change can actually happen a lot quicker than mutation rates. So that's a good thing. That's really interesting. So, yeah. So I think that it is kind of like an interesting idea that I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how. I don't know how that would go. Like the hitchhiking thing would go with the nearby methylation of those genes in those nucleotide sequences. I would think if it's becoming fixed in the population, then I don't know. It would have to be used, and you have to be selecting for it in order for it to go to fixation. But nearby, you could have something else that would be impacted. That's an interesting thought experiment. But overall, which is interesting, overall hitchhiking reduces the amount of genetic variation, but the hitchhiking mutation can itself be neutral, advantageous, or deleterious. And I think that would be what you would want to look for, and that's what you would look So this would be like some type of like silent mutation that still gave the same amino acid sequence, but that changed the nucleotide sequence somehow. So then you'd be able to watch this mutation as the local loci like went to fixation, or meaning that the variation in the population decreased. You could watch this to see and compare it. Anyway. This pattern is useful using population data to detect selective tweaks and hereby detect which genes have been under very recent selection. So anyway, all right. Well, that was fun. That was cool. Anyway, I'm out. So thank you for watching. I appreciate you. Get vaccinated, get boosted. Vaccines are safe and effective.